For most of human history, the ground did not welcome the human body. It pressed into bone, pulled heat away, and gave almost nothing back. And yet generation after generation still closed their eyes there, on earth that was cold, uneven, and rarely soft. Somewhere between that long beginning and the beds we now call normal, the body may have kept a memory it no longer knows how to explain. So what exactly changed between us and the ground beneath us? And why did 90% of human history sleep on hard ground? It is a strange thing to notice, usually late at night, that the body can be tired and still not trust the place where it is meant to rest. You lie down, and instead of disappearing into sleep, some quiet part of you begins measuring pressure. The shoulder meets resistance first, then the hip, then the back of the head. The body does not speak in words, but it keeps adjusting, as if it is searching for an older agreement between flesh and surface and failing to find it. That small discomfort feels modern, personal, almost trivial, but it may be pointing toward a much longer story. For most people now, a bed is so ordinary that it feels almost invisible. A mattress, a pillow, a raised frame, a dry room, a stable temperature, and some expectation of softness have become the background of night. When those things are missing, sleep can feel interrupted before it even begins. Yet across most of human history, that background did not exist in the form we know. The human body, in its long beginning, did not arrive each night to layers of padding designed to spread weight and reduce pressure points. It came down, more often, to ground that pushed back. Not always bare stone, not always frozen earth, not always the same from place to place, but usually something firmer, flatter, colder, or less forgiving than what many people now consider normal. That does not mean ancient people enjoyed discomfort in some simple, heroic way. It does not mean pain was irrelevant, or that the body was somehow built to prefer hardness. Those conclusions would go further than the evidence allows. What we can say more carefully is that for a very long span of time, humans slept under conditions in which softness was limited, temporary, uneven, or difficult to maintain. And if that was true for long enough, then the feeling many people have today that sleep should begin on a carefully engineered surface may not be a timeless expectation of the species, but a relatively recent habit layered over a much older biological history. The first question, then, is not whether the ground was good. It is why the body now often treats firmness as a problem to be solved immediately. Part of the answer may lie in how clearly the body maps contact. Sleep is not only a shutting down, it is also a surrender of posture, vigilance, and muscular control. To fall asleep, the body has to accept a surface for hours at a time. If that surface creates concentrated pressure, pulls heat away, or leaves parts of the body unsupported, sleep can become shallow, fragmented, or delayed. Modern bedding reduces some of these frictions so effectively that many people only notice the body's demands when comfort disappears. A bad hotel mattress, a night on the floor, a thin mat, a long flight, a bench, a hospital cot. These small disturbances reveal how quickly the body begins negotiating with hardness. But that same reaction can mislead us. It can tempt us to imagine that the human body has always been meant for cushioning, and that history before soft bedding was simply a long era of deprivation. The older picture is more complicated than that. Human life began in environments where sleep was shaped not by consumer choice, but by exposure, fatigue, temperature, group living, available materials, and the constant need to use what was present rather than what was ideal. In that world, the line between resting place and living ground was often thin. A sleeping surface might be improved with grass, hides, branches, ash, or plant matter, but it was still part of a landscape, not a separate technological system designed around spinal alignment or comfort preference. The body that lay down there was not necessarily less sensitive. It may simply have lived within a different range of nightly expectations, and that is where the modern feeling of wrongness becomes interesting. Because when a person now says, even silently, "I cannot sleep on this," they may be expressing more than individual preference. They may be revealing how far sleep has moved from one of the oldest conditions of human life. The ground, in deep history, was not a failure of civilization. It was the starting point. Before raised houses, before woven mattresses, before thick layers of stuffing, before mass-produced softness, There was the recurring problem of where to place a vulnerable body through the coldest and least conscious hours of the day. To understand why so much of human history passed on hard ground, we have to begin not with ancient toughness, but with a quieter and more uncomfortable possibility, that the body we think of as natural may already be shaped by comforts too recent to feel recent at all. And once that possibility appears, the bed stops looking universal. It starts looking historical, and the floor beneath it starts looking older than we usually let ourselves remember. There is another reason the hard surface feels so important to notice, and it has less to do with pain than with trust. Sleep asks the body to become still for long enough that it cannot constantly correct its own position. During waking life, discomfort can be managed through movement. A person shifts weight in a chair, stretches a leg, rolls the neck, leans against a wall, stands up, sits back down. But in sleep, movement becomes slower, less deliberate, and partly surrendered to the body's deeper rhythms. That is why even a modest pressure point can begin to feel strangely large at night. The body is not merely touching a surface. It is deciding, in a quiet and physical way, whether that surface can hold its vulnerability for hours. In the modern world, many of the answers to that question arrive before sleep even begins. Raised floors protect from dampness below, walls slow wind, roofing changes the path of rain, bedding spreads weight, traps air, softens edges, and creates the feeling that night has been prepared in advance for a human body. These conditions are so familiar that they can seem almost biological, as if human beings naturally belong inside an environment already adjusted to the spine, the shoulder, the neck, and the hip. Yet that is not where the long story of human sleep begins. For most of human history, the body approached rest without this thick layer of preparation. It approached darkness in a world where the sleeping place was not fully separated from the living ground, where the body's contact with the earth was more direct, and where comfort was shaped by arrangement rather than by equipment. This does not mean that people simply dropped onto bare soil without thought. On the contrary, the need to make a place fit for rest may have been one of the most ordinary and recurring human tasks. A patch of ground could be cleared, dried, covered, shared, or chosen for its slight advantages. It could be closer to warmth, less exposed to wind, or less likely to become wet overnight. But even after those adjustments, the result was still usually closer to the earth than to anything a modern sleeper would call a bed. That distance matters. The question in the title is not really about whether people had no awareness of bodily comfort. It is about why the baseline conditions of sleep remain so physically firm for so long. Part of the answer may be very simple. For most of the human past, there was no broad surplus of materials, labour, architecture, and stored domestic space strong enough to lift the sleeping body far away from the ground and keep it there consistently across generations. Softness, height, insulation, and separation all require material systems. They do not appear just because the body would benefit from them. They appear when a society can gather enough fibres, hides, stuffing, wood, woven structure, enclosed space, and repeated labour to make softness stable rather than temporary. That kind of stability arrived late. For a very long time, sleeping on a firm surface was not a cultural oddity. It was the ordinary starting condition from which only limited improvements were possible. Once that is understood, modern discomfort begins to look less like evidence against the past and more like evidence of distance from it. The body that hesitates on a hard floor today is real, but it is not standing outside history. It is standing inside a room shaped by many recent changes. Architecture, heating, raised furniture, dense textiles, private bedrooms, and the assumption that night should feel controlled from beginning to end. Deep human sleep began under another logic. The body did not wait for ideal softness before resting because waiting was rarely an option. It settled where conditions were tolerable enough, safe enough, and workable enough for one more night. That may be the quietest, but most important starting point for this entire story. Before we ask what ancient humans felt when they slept on hard ground, we first have to loosen the modern habit of imagining that a soft bed is the natural default from which all earlier sleep was a departure. History suggests the opposite. The ground came first, and nearly everything we now place between the body and the earth came later. For most of the time our species has existed, sleep did not begin inside a room built to receive it. It began outdoors, or at least in shelters far less separated from weather, ground, and darkness than most modern homes. That simple fact changes the whole question. When people now hear that humans slept on hard ground for most of history, they often imagine a bad substitute for a bed, as though the ancient world had failed to invent what the body had always needed. But in the deeper human past, the bed was not the missing object. The ground was the original setting. Early human life unfolded in landscapes where movement mattered, where groups followed water, animals, seasons, edible plants, safer terrain, or familiar routes across open land. In such conditions, the sleeping place was rarely a fully distinct category of built space. It was part of the camp, part of the shelter, part of the earth already being used for fire, tools, food, conversation, and protection. The same place that held footsteps by day often held bodies by night. That does not mean every night was spent under the open sky, and it does not mean all humans lived in exactly the same way. Different climates, different ecologies, and different forms of shelter would have changed the surface under the body, but the broad pattern remains widely accepted. For a very long stretch of human history, people lived without the kind of permanent, raised, padded sleeping environments that later became common in agricultural and urban societies. Sleep belonged to the landscape before it belonged to furniture. And once we begin there, the meaning of hard ground becomes less dramatic and more fundamental. The body did not descend each evening from a built world into a primitive inconvenience. It settled into the conditions that the world offered. Ground could be cleared, chosen, improved, shared, or covered, but it was still ground first. This is important because it helps us avoid two common mistakes. The first is to romanticize the past and imagine that early humans were naturally comfortable anywhere. The second is to assume that their nights must have been constant misery because they lacked soft bedding. Neither view is careful enough. What matters more is that sleep took place inside an environment where exposure shaped every decision. Dryness mattered, warmth mattered, wind mattered, slope mattered. The distance from insects, standing water, cold air, and danger mattered. In that context, a surface did not need to be soft to be good enough. It needed to be workable within the broader demands of survival. Even now, anyone who has spent a night outdoors learns that the quality of a resting place depends on more than pressure alone. A firm surface can be tolerable if it is dry and protected. A softer one can become miserable if it is wet, cold, or unstable. For early humans, this practical logic would have mattered far more than the modern ideal of plush comfort. The sleeping place was not judged in isolation from the night around it. It was one part of a larger arrangement involving fire, shelter, group proximity, and the materials at hand. This helps explain why the title question points us not first toward anatomy, but towards setting. Before we ask how the body handled hard surfaces, we have to ask what kind of world made hard surfaces normal in the first place. The answer begins with a species that spent most of its existence close to land, climate, and seasonal movement, long before it possessed the stable structures needed to separate rest from terrain. That older world did not offer a clean boundary between the human body and the earth beneath it, and because that boundary was thin, sleep remained materially simple for far longer than modern intuition suggests. A mattress can make softness feel universal, but it is actually a late achievement. The starting point of human sleep was much more exposed, much more dependent on place, and much more entangled with the raw conditions of being alive outdoors. So when we say that most of human history slept on hard ground, we are not describing a strange exception inside human life. We are describing the baseline from which later comforts slowly emerged, and the older environment that shaped the body long before softness became something a person could reasonably expect at the end of every day. To understand why the ground remained such a common sleeping surface, it helps to imagine how little of human history took place inside permanent interiors. For most of the existence of Homo sapiens, and even more broadly across earlier human ancestors, daily life was organized around movement through environments rather than long residence inside fixed buildings with stored domestic comfort. This is not a controversial point. Archaeology, paleoanthropology, and ethnographic comparison all support the broad view that mobile or semi-mobile lifeways dominated for a very long span of human time before villages, towns, and large settled households became widespread. In such worlds, night did not arrive inside a carefully insulated private room already furnished for rest. It arrived wherever a group had stopped, sheltered, and secured itself as best it could. That changes the meaning of sleep at a basic level. A modern bedroom is a specialized space. It is often separated from cooking, tool use, animals, weather, and many forms of noise. Its floor is raised and dry, its surfaces are managed, its bedding is stored, replaced, and maintained. But in the deeper human past, sleep was not always held inside that kind of specialization. It had to exist within the same general living zone as warmth, food preparation, shared space, and vigilance. A place might be improved for the night, but it was rarely transformed into an entirely separate technological environment built around softness. That is why hard ground should be understood first as a consequence of setting, not as a deliberate preference for discomfort. The earth beneath a sleeping person was often simply the available base layer of life. Of course, this does not mean people made no distinctions between better and worse places to lie down. Quite the opposite. Choosing where to rest would have mattered greatly. Slight elevation could reduce dampness. Proximity to a fire could change warmth, though too much smoke or heat might create other problems. Some surfaces would hold loose plant material better than others. Some places would stay drier through the night. Some would expose the body less to wind. In caves or rock shelters, the ground itself could vary from compact earth to stone to debris, and people likely responded to those differences in practical ways. But even with these variations, the important point remains. The sleeping surface was usually shaped by immediate landscape conditions and simple arrangements of material, not by a separate industry of bedding designed to remove the body from the ground. That separation came much later. This older pattern also reminds us that softness is not the only thing a sleeping body needs from a place. A very soft surface that traps moisture, collapses under weight, or leaves the body chilled can be worse than a firmer one that stays dry and predictable. For mobile human groups, predictability may often have mattered more than softness alone. A body can settle onto firmness if the wider conditions are manageable. It struggles more when the whole environment is unstable. This is one reason the title question leads naturally into landscape, rather than immediately into bones, joints, or muscles. Before there was a bed to compare against, there was only the problem of finding tolerable ground under changing conditions. And that problem belonged to geography as much as to anatomy. The body slept where climate, materials, and shelter allowed it to sleep. Seen in that light, the modern expectation that night should begin only after the body has been cushioned from the earth starts to look historically unusual. It is not unnatural in any simple sense, but it is recent. For most of human time, sleep remained materially close to the land, because human life itself remained materially close to the land. The people who lived in those long stretches of prehistory were not failing to create the modern bedroom. They were living within forms of mobility, exposure, and limited material accumulation that made the earth the default foundation of night. So when we ask why most of human history slept on hard ground, the first answer is not that humans once liked hardness more than we do now. It is that they inhabited a world in which rest still belonged to terrain, and the distance between body and earth was usually small. That older closeness to the ground was not a detail at the edge of human life. It was one of its most ordinary conditions. The longer we remain inside the modern idea of sleep, the easier it is to misunderstand what the ground meant in earlier human life. Today, a sleeping surface is usually something prepared in advance and protected from the rest of the world. It belongs to a room, often to a single person or household, and is expected to remain clean, dry, stable, and available every night. That stability is so normal now that it can make earlier forms of sleep look incomplete, as though the human body spent most of its history waiting for the invention of comfort. But the broader human story points in another direction. For most of the deep past, people did not live in a world organized around permanent private interiors. They lived in landscapes where shelter could be temporary, partial, seasonal, or shared in ways that kept the body much closer to the conditions outside. In that setting, the place of sleep was not an isolated zone protected from the wider environment. It was one part of the environment itself. The earth beneath the body was not a fallback chosen after better options failed. It was the starting material from which rest had to be arranged. That is why the phrase hard ground should be understood with some care. It does not mean a single universal surface, and it does not mean every human group in every climate slept in exactly the same way. Conditions varied greatly. Some groups had access to caves or rock shelters. Others used open camps, windbreaks, simple structures, or more substantial dwellings in later periods. Some places offered grasses, reeds, branches, hides, or other materials that could be laid down between body and soil. Some environments were dry and open, others wet and cold, others dense with insects or shifting ground. But across those differences, one pattern remains broadly consistent and widely accepted. For a very large share of human history, sleeping surfaces remain materially simple and relatively close to the earth compared with what later societies could create. This matters because it keeps the title grounded in reality. The question is not whether all early humans slept directly on bare dirt every night. The question is why. For such a long period, the body usually came to rest on surfaces that were only lightly modified versions of the land itself. The answer lies in the scale of human history. Permanent buildings, raised household furniture, thick mattresses, stuffed bedding, and the routine expectation of softness belong to a much later world shaped by agriculture, stored resources, specialized labor, and durable domestic space. Those things did not exist through most of the long eras in which human bodies were already recognizably human. In that older timeline, rest had to be made from what could be gathered, carried, reused, or quickly arranged. The ground therefore remained central not because humans failed to notice discomfort, but because the conditions needed to lift sleep far away from the earth were rare, local, or historically late. Once we see that, a different picture begins to form. The human night was not built first around luxury, or even around softness. It was built around tolerable placement within exposure. A good place to sleep may have been one that avoided moisture, reduced heat loss, sat near others, and offered some protection from wind or uneven terrain. These practical advantages could matter more than whether the body sank into a soft layer. Modern sleep often begins with the expectation that comfort can be optimized. Earlier sleep, for much of human history, began with the question of what could be made workable before darkness deepened and the body had to let go. That is the larger meaning of this truck. The ground remained normal because the human world remained, for a very long time, materially close to ground. The distance between body and earth that now feels ordinary was not ordinary at the beginning. It had to be built slowly across history, and until that happened, sleep remained tied to terrain, to weather, to camp, to shelter, and to whatever thin improvements human hands could place between vulnerable skin and the surface that was already there. This does not make the past simple, and it does not make hardness harmless. It only helps us begin from a more accurate place. For most of human history, the ground was not the opposite of the sleeping world. It was the sleeping world. When modern people hear the phrase hard ground, the mind often produces a single image: a bare, cold, flat surface pressing directly into the body through the night. But that image is too simple for most of human history. The ground was not one thing. It changed from region to region, season to season, shelter to shelter, and even from one part of a camp to another. A sleeping place might be compact earth, dry grass over soil, a layer of leaves, packed ash near a fire, animal skin spread over uneven terrain, sandy ground, cave sediment, wooden platforms in some later settings, or a mixture of several materials arranged as well as circumstances allowed. None of these should be confused with the thick, engineered softness familiar to many people today, but neither should they all be treated as the same experience. This distinction matters because the title question can easily be misunderstood if hard ground is imagined too literally. The broader and more careful point is that for most of human history, people usually slept on surfaces that remained relatively firm and close to the earth, even when they were modified with simple materials. That is different from saying they always slept directly on naked soil or stone. Archaeology and ethnographic comparison both support the idea that humans often altered sleeping spaces with available matter such as plant material, hides, or other surface layers, though the exact details vary greatly by place and period and are not always preserved clearly in the record. What remains widely accepted is the basic pattern. The body often rested on ground that had been adjusted, not replaced. And that phrase may be the most useful one to keep in mind. Adjusted, not replaced. The land remained the base layer. Human effort could improve it, but usually did not remove it from the equation. A bed in the modern sense separates the sleeper from the floor through a stable system of height, structure, and padding. Most earlier sleeping surfaces did much less. They could soften edges, reduce moisture, retain warmth, or make a place cleaner, but they still left the body in a much more direct relationship with terrain. That relationship could vary a great deal. A layer of dry grass on firm soil would feel different from damp leaves over mud. Compacted earth inside a shelter would feel different from rough stone inside a cave. Sand can feel soft for a moment and then become cold, unstable, or difficult to settle into. Ash and plant litter can insulate in one context and irritate in another. Animal skins can add warmth and reduce friction, but they do not erase the firmness beneath them unless enough other material is present as well. These differences remind us that the ancient human night was not defined by one universal sleeping texture. It was defined by the constant need to work with materials that were local, perishable, and limited. This is why softness should be treated as a variable, not as a clear dividing line between past and present. Even now, the comfort of a sleeping place depends on more than softness alone. A slightly firm surface can feel tolerable when it is dry, warm, and stable. A softer one can feel far worse when it is damp, lumpy, cold, or full of irritants. For earlier humans, these broader conditions would have shaped the experience of sleep at least as much as the simple hardness of the ground itself. In some cases, a place that looks uncomfortable to modern imagination may have been chosen because it was cleaner, drier, safer, or easier to maintain than the alternatives nearby. In other cases, the materials available for cushioning may have been thin, temporary, or too valuable to use generously. The result was a world in which many people slept with some kind of layer beneath them, but still much nearer to the earth than most sleepers are now. That is the key shift this truk begins to make. The title is not about proving that every ancient sleeper endured the same rough night. It is about understanding that the surfaces of human rest were historically diverse, yet still usually firm by modern standards. Once we let go of the false image of one endless stone floor, the story becomes more human and more believable. People did not simply submit to a single harsh condition. They selected, arranged, and improved sleeping places within the limits of their environment. But those improvements took place on top of the land, not far away from it. And that is why, even with variation, the deeper pattern still holds. Most of human history slept on surfaces that were shaped by the ground more than by furniture. What people placed between their bodies and the ground was often less important than what those materials could and could not do. A thin layer of grass, reeds, leaves, fur, or scraped plant matter might soften first contact, reduce some loss of heat, and make a surface feel less raw against skin. But such layers were rarely equivalent to the thick, stable cushioning that modern people now take for granted. They compressed quickly, shifted during the night, absorbed moisture, broke down, and depended on season, climate, labour, and local ecology. This is one reason it is useful to think in terms of degrees rather than categories. The past was not divided neatly into people who slept on bare earth and people who slept on beds. Much of the long human story sits in between. Surfaces were often modified, but modestly. They were made more tolerable, not transformed into something fully separate from the land. This middle ground is important because it helps explain why the title question remains accurate without becoming exaggerated. If a group laid down grass over compact soil, that was not the same as a mattress, but it was also not nothing. If people spread hides over earth near a sheltered area, that could matter for warmth and friction, but the firmness underneath would still shape the body's experience. If a floor inside a simple dwelling or shelter was packed and maintained, it might offer predictability and dryness, yet still remain hard by modern expectations. In each case, human effort could improve the night without abolishing the underlying condition that sleep remained materially close to ground. The archaeological record, limited as it is, points toward this kind of practical arrangement, rather than toward a sudden jump from earth to comfort. In some sites, evidence suggests prepared surfaces, plant remains, or repeated use of specific resting areas. In many others, the perishable materials that would have mattered most simply do not survive well enough to tell a full story. That gap is worth respecting. We should not claim more certainty than the evidence supports, but the absence of perfect preservation does not make the broader pattern doubtful. Across prehistory and much of later history as well, human sleeping places were commonly built from what decayed fastest and left the least visible trace. Fibers, skins, leaves, mats, brush, and other materials that belong to ordinary domestic life rather than monumental construction. The softness they provided, when they provided it, was almost certainly uneven. A body sleeping on such a surface would still register ridges, pressure, slope, and temperature much more directly than many bodies do now. This is where the modern imagination can again become misleading. Because we tend to think of comfort as something engineered to remain consistent from edge to edge, we easily underestimate the fragility of earlier sleeping materials. A modern bed is designed to keep performing after night. A bedroll of plant matter or skins may need constant maintenance, refreshing, drying, cleaning, or rearranging. It can flatten under the body, shift as people move, and lose many of its benefits after repeated use. That does not make it useless. It only means that even where people created softer layers, softness itself was unstable. The ground remained present beneath the improvement. In that sense, much of human history probably did not sleep on hardness as a pure condition, but on firmness filtered through temporary material. That distinction deepens the title instead of weakening it. It suggests that human beings were not passively enduring the earth. They were actively negotiating with it, using local resources to alter the terms of contact as much as they could. Yet the scale of alteration remained limited for most of the long story. There was no thick industrial buffer, no standard domestic expectation that every body deserved the same depth of support each night, no large system ensuring that softness could be preserved through changing weather and repeated use. What existed instead was adaptation through arrangement. An arrangement has limits. By modern standards, even a carefully prepared prehistoric or early historical sleeping surface would often still count as hard, not because no effort had been made, but because the effort took place within a very narrow material range. Once we see that, the title question becomes easier to inhabit calmly. Why did so much of human history sleep on hard ground? Because even when human hands improved the surface, those improvements usually remained thin, local, perishable, and close to the earth itself. The softness that now feels ordinary was, for a very long time, only partial. A useful way to think about the ancient sleeping surface is this. It was often made, but rarely manufactured. Human hands could prepare a place for rest, sometimes with care and repetition, yet the result still remained very different from the layered, standardized sleeping systems that many people now expect. In the modern world, when a surface feels wrong, it can usually be replaced. A mattress can be softer, firmer, thicker, cooler, newer, cleaner. But for most of human history, the sleeping place depended on what a landscape already offered, and what a group could gather, carry, dry, or arrange with limited effort. That meant variation was constant, but so were limits. A patch of compacted earth inside a shelter might become familiar over many nights and therefore easier to maintain. A cave floor could be cleared and perhaps improved with plant material or skins, yet still remain uneven, cold, or resistant under the body. Ground near a hearth might offer warmth and dryness, but also ash, smoke, dirt, and the need to share space carefully. Sandy soil might seem gentler at first touch, then shift under weight and lose warmth quickly after dark. Grass and leaves could soften a surface for a time, but they also compressed, scattered, held moisture in some conditions, and needed to be refreshed. Even animal hides, which could matter greatly in colder settings, changed the quality of contact without necessarily removing the firmness beneath them. This is why it would be misleading to describe the long human past as either a world of bare ground or a world of primitive beds. It was more often a world of partial solutions. The body came to rest on surfaces that people had worked on, selected, or improved, but usually within narrow material limits. That narrowness matters. The difference between a modern mattress and a prepared ground layer is not only softness, it is consistency. Modern bedding aims to produce the same broad feeling across the whole body and across many nights. Earlier sleeping materials were often irregular by nature. They could bunch in one place, thin out in another, and change from evening to morning or from one season to the next. The body, therefore, was not just lying on a surface. It was lying on a surface whose properties could shift with weather, use, decay, and available labour. That instability may be one reason the phrase hard ground remains useful even when it sounds too blunt. It points not to a single texture, but to a general condition in which the earth still shaped the night more than any man-made structure did. And that condition lasted a very long time. What survives in the evidence from archaeology often reflects this only indirectly. Durable stone tools, hearths, sediments, and built features preserve more readily than fibres, leaves, skins, or bedding layers. So the record tends to show the base more clearly than the softness that may once have rested above it. That should make us careful, not dismissive. We should not pretend to know the exact feel of every prehistoric sleeping place, but neither should we assume the missing layers were so thick or so permanent that they transformed the ancient night into something close to ours. The broader and more cautious conclusion is simpler. People often modified the ground, but most of those modifications remained temporary, local, and materially thin. In that sense, the surface of sleep was never just geology, but it was never far from geology either. This helps explain why comfort in earlier human life was probably understood through a wider lens than it is now. A good place to sleep may not have been the softest possible one. It may have been the driest, the warmest, the cleanest, the least exposed, or the easiest to restore the following night. Under those conditions, firmness could be tolerated if it came with other advantages, while softness alone may have meant little if the place stayed damp or unstable. So the deeper meaning of this truck is not simply that ancient humans slept on many different surfaces. It is that all those surfaces, despite their differences, still belong to a world in which sleep remained close to the land, dependent on modest adjustments rather than complete separation. Once we see that, the title becomes more precise. Most of human history slept on hard ground not because every night was the same, and not because people ignored comfort, but because the materials capable of making sleep truly soft, thick, dry, durable, and repeatable were absent, scarce, or historically late. For thousands upon thousands of years, the human body entered the night through a surface that had been helped, perhaps carefully, but not fully remade. That may be the most accurate picture of all. Not bare earth, not real bedding in the modern sense, but a long middle ground in which human rest was always one thin layer away from the world beneath it. The question becomes more delicate once we move from ground to body, because it is very easy to say too much. A modern person lies on a firm surface and quickly feels pressure in the shoulder, hip, lower back, or side of the head. From that experience, it is tempting to leap toward a dramatic conclusion. Either the human body must be poorly designed for hard ground, or ancient humans must have possessed some lost physical toughness that we no longer have. But neither idea is necessary, and neither is especially careful. The body is not a simple object built for one perfect sleeping surface. It is a living structure that can rest under many conditions, though not equally well and not without trade-offs. That is the more useful place to begin. Human sleep depends on posture, temperature, fatigue, age, health, body composition, and the surface beneath the body. A firmer surface changes how weight is distributed. It concentrates pressure more strongly on bony areas, especially when a person lies on the side. It can also reduce the amount the body sinks, which changes the way the spine, shoulders, and hips settle during the night. None of this is controversial. What matters is how we interpret it in historical terms. The body can tolerate a range of sleeping conditions, but tolerance is not the same as preference, and survival is not the same as ideal rest. For most of human history, people did not need to be biologically optimized for hard ground in order to sleep on it. They only needed to live in a world where sleeping on relatively firm surfaces was common, unavoidable, and made more tolerable through behavior, material layers, and daily routine. That shifts the focus away from dramatic anatomical claims and toward a quieter truth. Much of the human relationship to sleep may have been behavioral rather than structural. A person who spends long days moving, squatting, walking, carrying, and changing posture may arrive at night with a body that uses its joints, muscles, and connective tissues differently from a body shaped by many hours of sitting and highly managed indoor surfaces. That does not mean ancient bodies were a different species of body. It means the same human anatomy can be lived in under very different patterns of daily use. And those patterns may change what feels tolerable at night. The body also has another ability that matters here. It can shift position repeatedly during sleep. Even on a modern mattress, people do not remain perfectly still. They roll, adjust, bend the knees, change the angle of the neck, tuck an arm, or draw the body inward. On a firmer surface, such movements may become even more important because they help redistribute pressure across the night. This does not make hardness disappear, but it means the human body has always possessed ways of managing contact other than simply sinking into softness. Posture, shared warmth, coverings, and chosen sleeping positions may all have mattered as much as the surface alone. That is why it would be wrong to imagine the prehistoric sleeper as a rigid body lying flat on bare earth in one unchanging pose. Human sleep was almost certainly more active, more adjusted, and more responsive than that image suggests. At the same time, we should not romanticize the matter. Harder surfaces likely did create discomfort, poor sleep, or pain for many people, especially the injured, the elderly, the very young, or those already burdened by illness. The body's ability to endure does not erase its vulnerability. This is especially important for a topic like this, because the title can invite a false impression that sleeping on hard ground must therefore be natural in the sense of universally beneficial. The evidence does not support such a simple conclusion. What it supports more safely is something narrower. Human beings can sleep on relatively firm surfaces because the body is flexible, behavior can compensate for some discomfort, and the long history of human life unfolded before soft bedding became normal. That is not proof that hard ground was best. It is proof that the body, within limits, can function in conditions that modern comfort has made feel unusual. So this truck begins with restraint. The human body was not specially built to love the ground, but it was capable of living close to it. That distinction matters. It keeps us from turning history into myth. The deeper question is not whether ancient humans had stronger backs or a superior relationship to discomfort. It is how one ordinary human body, recognizably like our own, could pass through night after night on surfaces far firmer than most modern sleepers now expect, and what forms of posture, movement, and daily life made that possible often enough for most of human history. One of the safest ways to think about the human body on firm ground is to stop imagining sleep as a single moment and start seeing it as a long physical process. A person does not simply lie down and remain unchanged until morning. Over the course of the night, breathing deepens and lightens, muscles release and tighten again, body temperature shifts, limbs change position, and pressure slowly builds in some areas, until the sleeper turns or curls or extends without fully waking. This pattern matters because the body's relationship to a hard surface is not static. It is negotiated over hours. A modern mattress reduces part of that negotiation by spreading pressure more evenly. A firmer sleeping place leaves more of that work to posture and movement. That is not speculation beyond accepted knowledge. It follows from ordinary sleep physiology and from the simple mechanics of how bodies meet surfaces. Where the surface gives less, the body must redistribute more. That redistribution may happen through small turns, a bent knee, an arm under the head, a partial curl of the spine, or a shift from one side to the other. Such movements do not mean sleep has failed. They are part of how sleep is maintained under imperfect conditions. This is important because it helps explain how one human body could spend long periods of history resting on firmer ground without requiring us to claim that ancient people felt no discomfort. They likely did feel it, at least some of the time. But sleep does not require perfect stillness or perfect support. It requires that the body can remain within a tolerable range long enough and repeatedly enough to get through the night. Another point that can be made cautiously is that daily physical life probably changed what felt tolerable. A body that walks often, rises from the ground regularly, carries weight, squats, kneels, and changes posture throughout the day is using its joints and soft tissues differently from a body that spends many hours in chairs, cars, and fixed indoor positions. This does not mean one body is superior, or that the past was healthier in every respect. It only means that posture is historical. Human anatomy stays broadly the same, but the way that anatomy is used each day can shift. A modern sleeper often arrives at bed after long periods of compression in a chair and relative sameness of movement. Earlier humans, in many settings, likely arrived at night through more varied bodily use. That difference alone may have shaped how the body settled onto the ground, how quickly it changed position, and what it considered tolerable. This is a careful point because it does not claim that prehistoric life made everyone physically resilient in the same way. It only says that bodies are influenced by repeated daily patterns, which is well accepted. Temperature also belongs to this biological story. A sleeping body is not dealing only with pressure. It is dealing with heat. Firm ground can pull heat away, especially in cool or damp conditions, which means that insulation beneath the body may matter even when cushioning is thin. This may be one reason simple layers such as grasses, hides, mats, or other local materials could matter beyond softness alone. They did not need to feel luxurious to change the biological experience of the night. Even a modest barrier between body and ground could alter warmth, friction, and surface dryness. In that sense, the body may often have needed not a soft bed in the modern sense, but enough separation to reduce the most direct costs of contact. This also explains why sleeping close to others could matter biologically as well as socially. Shared warmth reduces exposure, and group sleeping is a widespread human pattern in many historical settings. Again, that is not proof that the surface stopped being firm. It is only a reminder that the body sleeps as part of a whole arrangement, not as an isolated object dropped onto a texture. Surface, posture, covering, shelter, warmth, and proximity all work together. Once we look at the body this way, the title question becomes more precise. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Not because the skeleton was built for punishment, and not because pain did not matter, but because the human body can rest under a range of conditions when behavior, movement, coverings, warmth, and routine help keep those conditions tolerable enough. The body has limits, but it also has flexibility. That flexibility is not dramatic or mysterious. It is ordinary. It belongs to a species that spent a very long time sleeping before thick, stable softness became a common expectation. So the real lesson of this part is modest but important. The body did not need to be transformed into something other than human in order to sleep on firm ground. It only needed to do what bodies have always done under imperfect conditions: adjust, shift, conserve heat, and keep negotiating with the surface until morning. That does not make hard ground ideal. It only makes it historically possible, and that may be enough to explain why it remained so common for so long. A firmer sleeping surface does not affect every part of the body in the same way, and that unevenness may be one of the simplest reasons human sleep on hard ground was possible but rarely neutral. When the body lies down, pressure is concentrated most strongly where bone sits closer to the surface, which is why the shoulder, hip, side of the rib cage, back of the head, and heels can become the first places that demand attention. Modern sleep systems are designed in part to redistribute that pressure, while on a firmer surface the body itself has to do more of the work through small turns and repeated repositioning. Sleep research and clinical pressure injury literature both support the basic point that changing position redistributes load and reduces sustained pressure on one area, even if the exact pattern differs from person to person. That makes it easier to imagine how ordinary human sleep could continue on relatively firm ground without requiring us to assume that discomfort disappeared. The body does not solve the problem once. It keeps solving it quietly across the night. At the same time, pressure is only part of the story. Sleep is closely tied to thermoregulation, and contact with the sleeping surface affects how the body exchanges heat with its surroundings. Reviews on sleep and thermoregulation show that thermal conditions strongly influence sleep quality, and that both excessive heat and cold can disrupt sleep. A surface beneath the body, therefore, matters not only because it feels hard or soft, but because it can either preserve warmth or draw it away. This helps explain why even thin layers of plant material, hides, mats, or other coverings could matter biologically without turning the surface into anything like a modern mattress. Their value may often have been modest but real: less direct contact, less heat loss, less moisture reaching the body, and slightly more stability over the course of the night. None of this proves that ancient humans slept comfortably by modern standards. It only shows that the body can gain meaningful relief from small changes in the sleeping setup, especially when warmth and pressure are managed together. Another careful point is that the body's tolerance of firmness depends on the whole pattern of life around sleep. A human body that has moved through the day in varied ways is not the same, in practical terms, as a body that has spent many hours fixed in chairs and enclosed interiors. This is not a claim that earlier humans had magically superior skeletons or pain thresholds. It is simply an acknowledgement that posture, soft tissue loading, joint range, and habitual movement are influenced by repeated daily behavior. A body accustomed to frequent squatting, kneeling, walking, carrying, and rising from the ground may approach rest differently from one that has been shaped by long periods of sitting and highly cushioned surfaces. That difference would not erase the pressure of hard ground, but it could change how quickly the body adjusts, which positions feel workable, and how much of the night can be tolerated before sleep is broken. This is one reason it is safer to think in terms of ordinary flexibility rather than dramatic adaptation. Human bodies do not need to be fundamentally different to handle different sleeping conditions. They only need to arrive at night through different routines, with different expectations, and with different ways of distributing strain. The same caution applies to sleeping posture itself. People do not sleep as fixed statues. Even under modern conditions, sleepers shift position through the night, and those changes are part of normal sleep rather than evidence that rest has failed. On firmer ground, such movement may have mattered even more, because a bend in the knees, a partial curl, a turn from one side to the other, or an arm used briefly as support can all alter pressure and contact enough to keep the body within a tolerable range. That does not make hard ground beneficial in a simple sense, and it does not remove the likelihood that many people, especially the old, the injured, or the sick, would have paid a higher price. But it does help answer the central question without exaggeration. Most of human history could sleep on hard ground because the human body is capable of repositioning, conserving warmth, and resting under imperfect conditions when the wider arrangement of shelter, coverings, and routine makes those conditions survivable often enough. The body was not built to love hardness, but neither was it so fragile that softness had to come first. For a very long time, it lived in the narrow space between those two truths, adjusting night after night to a world in which the earth remained much closer to sleep than it is for most people now. Archaeology can tell us something about ancient sleep, but only if we stay patient with its limits. A sleeping place is one of the hardest human habits to preserve clearly across deep time, because the materials that matter most at night are often the ones that disappear first. Grass, reeds, skins, mats, loose plant matter, and other soft layers decay quickly. What survives more often are hearths, stone tools, sediments, compacted surfaces, ash layers, and traces of repeated activity across a site. So when archaeologists study how people may have slept, they are usually not uncovering a complete bed in the modern sense. They are reading patterns in floors, residues, microlayers, plant remains, hearth locations, and the repeated use of space. That is why this truk has to proceed carefully. The evidence can be meaningful without being complete. In some well-studied sites, archaeologists have found strong signs that people prepared surfaces with plant material, maintained occupation floors, or organized living areas in ways that suggest repeated resting zones. Work at Sibudu Cave in South Africa is one of the clearest examples where researchers identified ancient grass bedding and evidence of repeated use, burning, and replacement over time. Findings like this matter because they show that people were not simply dropping onto whatever ground happened to be beneath them. They were modifying surfaces in practical ways. At the same time, evidence like Sibudu is important partly because it is exceptional in how much detail was preserved. Most sites do not give that kind of clarity, and that matters just as much. The absence of preserved bedding at many sites does not prove that no bedding existed. It often proves only that perishable materials leave a fragile archaeological record. This is one of the central lessons of occupation surface research. Archaeologists can often detect that a floor was used, maintained, compacted, heated, trampled, or repeatedly occupied, but identifying a precise sleeping place within that broader space is much harder and often remains an inference rather than a certainty. That means we should resist two opposite mistakes. One is to claim that prehistoric people mostly slept directly on bare dirt because bedding is rarely found. The other is to imagine rich sleeping systems everywhere just because a few sites preserve special evidence. The safer conclusion lies in between. The record strongly supports the idea that humans often arranged and reused living surfaces, and in some cases prepared resting areas with plant materials or other layers. But it also supports the larger reality that most of those sleeping surfaces remained materially simple and close to the ground compared with later beds and modern mattresses. Archaeology also reminds us that a sleeping place was usually part of a larger domestic landscape. A hearth, a work area, waste patterns, pathways through a shelter, and the distribution of residues all help researchers think about how space was organized. Sleep, in this sense, does not appear as an isolated object. It appears as one activity among others inside a lived surface. This is useful because it fits the broader story of the video. For most of human history, sleep was not housed inside a separate, highly specialized room designed only for rest. It happened on occupation surfaces that also belonged to the wider practical life of shelter. The more archaeology learns about ancient floors, the clearer that point becomes. What we usually recover is not comfort in the modern sense, but evidence of repeated adaptation, cleared spaces, prepared layers, maintained surfaces, and simple efforts to make the ground more workable. So archaeology does not let us say exactly how a prehistoric shoulder or hip felt in the night, and it does not justify sweeping claims that all early humans slept the same way. But it does let us say something important with confidence. Across a very long stretch of time, human rest was organized on surfaces that were selected, modified, and reused, yet still remained physically close to the earth itself. That is enough to keep the title grounded in evidence rather than myth. Most of human history slept on hard ground not because people ignored comfort, but because the archaeological record points again and again to a world where sleep was made on occupation surfaces, with modest improvements, inside a material reality still anchored to the ground. Archaeology becomes most useful on this question when it stops searching for a prehistoric version of a modern bed and begins instead with something humbler, the floor. Across deep time, the softest parts of a sleeping place are usually the least likely to survive. Grass, reeds, leaves, skins, mats, and other light materials decay quickly, while ash, hearths, compacted sediments, trampled surfaces, and traces of repeated occupation remain visible much longer. That is why archaeologists usually do not recover sleep as a complete object. They recover it indirectly, through occupation surfaces, microscopic residues, plant traces, burned layers, and the broader organization of space. In other words, the evidence is often better at showing that people repeatedly used and maintained a surface than at showing exactly how soft that surface felt against a human shoulder or hip. This is an important limit, because it protects us from saying too much. When bedding is not preserved, that does not prove people slept directly on bare earth. It often proves only that the materials most likely to lie beneath the body were also the least likely to endure for thousands of years. But the opposite mistake is also easy to make. A few striking finds of preserved plant bedding do not mean that prehistoric sleep was widely cushioned in a way close to later beds. The safer conclusion lies between those extremes. Archaeology strongly suggests that human groups often selected, prepared, reused, and sometimes lightly layered the surfaces on which they lived and rested. Yet those surfaces usually remain materially close to the ground itself. Some of the clearest evidence comes from southern Africa, where researchers have identified ancient grass bedding and signs that such bedding was sometimes burned and renewed. These findings are valuable not because they prove one universal sleeping method, but because they show clearly that people in some contexts were actively modifying the ground beneath them with simple plant materials. That matters for the title of this video. It means the phrase hard ground should not be imagined as untouched dirt in every case. Human hands often intervened. The ground could be cleared, lined, dried, refreshed, or improved. But the scale of that improvement was still limited compared with the later history of raised frames, stuffed surfaces, and durable domestic bedding. This is also why archaeologists pay so much attention to the wider use of space within a site. A sleeping area does not usually appear as an isolated room marked for rest alone. It appears as one part of an occupation surface that also contains hearths, residues of daily activity, movement patterns, and the remains of repeated habitation. Sleep, in that older world, belonged to the same material field as cooking, gathering, tool use, warmth, and shelter. The floor was not simply the place under the bed, it was the lived surface of life itself. That broader pattern fits the larger history of human environments before private bedrooms and permanent domestic interiors became common. For most of human history, people did not sleep inside highly specialized spaces built only to separate the body from the earth. They slept on occupation surfaces that had been worked on and made more tolerable but not fully remade. Archaeology, when read carefully, keeps bringing us back to that middle ground. It does not support a dramatic image of endless human misery on naked stone, but it also does not support the comforting fantasy that most ancient people slept on anything like the stable, thick, predictable surfaces many modern sleepers now consider normal. What it supports instead is something quieter and more believable. Humans repeatedly improved the ground, but they usually remained very near it. That is enough to answer this part of the title honestly. Most of human history slept on hard ground, because even when the surface was modified, the sleeping world was still built from occupation floors, perishable layers, and simple arrangements of local material, not from the fully separate systems of bedding that would come much later. The deeper lesson of archaeology is not that it gives us a perfect picture of ancient sleep, but that it teaches us how to live with partial evidence without losing the larger pattern. A sleeping place is difficult to preserve because rest leaves light traces. A hearth can harden a surface, ash can survive in layers, trampling can compact sediment, and repeated occupation can shape a floor in ways that remain visible long after the people are gone. But the things most likely to touch the human body at night are often the things least likely to endure. A mat, a spread of grasses, a hide, a layer of leaves, or other simple coverings may matter greatly in the lived experience of sleep, yet leave almost nothing that lasts across long stretches of time. This is why archaeology so often shows us the base of life more clearly than the softness above it. That imbalance can be frustrating, but it is also useful. It prevents us from telling an overly neat story. We cannot honestly say that prehistoric people everywhere slept directly on bare ground because the record is too incomplete for that. But we also cannot honestly say that they usually slept on anything close to later beds, because the surviving evidence points again and again to prepared surfaces that remained close to the earth. The strongest interpretation is therefore a modest one. Human beings often improved the ground beneath them, but usually in ways that were thin, local, perishable, and limited by environment. That conclusion fits not only the archaeological record itself, but the larger logic of pre-modern life. Before permanent architecture, stored domestic materials, and durable furniture became widespread, sleep had to be made from what was present. A place could be cleared, leveled, dried, lined, reused, and maintained. It could become familiar over many nights. It could be kept near warmth or placed where wind and moisture were less severe. But even then, the sleeping surface was usually still part of an occupation floor rather than a separate technology designed to hold the body away from the land. This is one reason archaeology often studies sleep through the organization of space rather than through objects alone. Where is the hearth? Where are the areas of repeated activity? Which surfaces were maintained? Where do residues gather? Where do plant traces survive? These questions do not give us a single frozen image of a sleeping person, yet together they reveal something more important. Rest in much of human history belonged to the same surface as the rest of life. It was not isolated in a private room with a specialized bed. It was woven into a camp, a shelter, a cave floor, a household space, a lived ground. That is the larger pattern archaeology helps recover. And once that pattern becomes visible, the title of this video begins to feel less dramatic and more historical. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Because for most of human history, the human world itself was still organized on the ground. Sleep was not separate from that world. It happened within it, with whatever modest layers people could create between skin and surface. The archaeological record does not need to show us a preserved mattress to make this clear. In some places, it preserves direct signs of bedding. In many more, it preserves only the worked floor beneath it. But taken together, those traces still point in the same direction. Human beings were not strangers to preparing the surfaces where they rested. Yet the scale of those preparations remained small compared with the thick, durable, predictable softness that later societies would slowly build. So this is where the archaeological question settles, not into certainty about every detail, but into confidence about the broad shape of the past. Most of human history slept on surfaces that were chosen, arranged, reused, and sometimes softened, but rarely transformed into anything far removed from the earth itself. Archaeology cannot tell us every sensation of those nights. It can tell us something quieter and stronger. The ground remained the foundation of human rest for far longer than modern comfort allows us to easily remember. For a body trying to sleep in a colder or more changeable world, softness may not have been the first problem to solve. Warmth may have mattered more. This is one of the easiest parts of the title to misunderstand from a modern room. Today, many people fall asleep in houses that already reduce wind, block moisture, and hold a fairly stable temperature through the night. Under those conditions, the sleeping surface is often judged mainly by how it feels against the body. But in much of human history, the body met the ground inside a wider struggle against cold air, dampness, and heat loss after sunset. Once night begins, the human body does not simply rest. It must also conserve heat. That matters because the ground can draw warmth away through direct contact, especially when it is cold, wet, or dense. A firm surface, therefore, becomes important not only because it presses into the body, but because it can quietly take heat from it for hours. This changes the whole meaning of a sleeping place. A surface did not have to feel soft to be valuable. It had to help the body avoid becoming too cold before morning. In that older world, a dry patch of firm earth could be preferable to a softer place that held moisture or exposed the sleeper to greater heat loss. Even a thin layer of grass, leaves, reeds, skins, or other local material could matter not because it created luxury, but because it reduced direct contact with cold ground and trapped a little more air beneath the body. That is a modest improvement by modern standards. Yet biologically it may have mattered a great deal. Warmth and dryness are not decorative comforts. They are basic conditions that shape whether rest remains possible at all. This is one reason the title question must be understood through climate as well as through anatomy. Humans did not sleep on relatively hard ground simply because they lacked the idea of softness. They often slept there because the more urgent task was to create a tolerable thermal environment from limited materials. Fire belongs to this story, but so does distance from fire. Sleeping too far away could mean greater cold. Too close could mean smoke, sparks, or discomfort of another kind. So a resting place was often part of a larger arrangement that balanced heat, air, shelter, and shared space. The body was not choosing a mattress. It was entering a small environmental system built as well as possible from what was available that evening. This helps explain why some simple sleeping materials appear again and again in the broader human record. Their importance may have been less about softness in the modern sense, and more about insulation, dryness, cleanliness, and the ability to make the same patch of ground more tolerable night after night. A slightly raised or better drained surface could matter. A place sheltered from wind could matter. A dry layer beneath the body could matter. In such conditions, the difference between a good and bad night may have depended less on whether the ground felt soft, and more on whether the body could hold enough warmth to drift into deeper sleep. That does not mean hardness was irrelevant. Pressure still existed. Hips, shoulders, and back still met resistance. But when the night is cold, the body may accept a firm surface more readily than a damp or exposed one. This is not a romantic claim. It is simply the practical logic of rest in environments where temperature could shape survival more directly than comfort preference. Seen this way, the title begins to shift. Most of human history may not have slept on hard ground because hard ground was desirable. It may have slept there because a workable sleeping place was judged by many things at once, and warmth often came before softness. The body needed a place that was dry enough, sheltered enough, and insulating enough to make sleep possible under the conditions of that night. In many cases, that meant the ground remained present beneath the sleeper, while modest layers of material did the smaller but essential work of interrupting heat loss. So this truck begins with a quiet correction to the modern imagination. The ancient human night was not organized first around plush comfort. It was organized around tolerable survival of the body through darkness, cold, and exposure. And in that world, the best surface may often have been not the softest one, but the one that let the body keep enough of its own warmth until morning. A sleeping place can look poor to modern eyes and still solve the most important problem of the night. This is easier to understand once we remember that the human body loses heat not only to the air around it but also to the surface beneath it. A soft surface that is damp, unstable, or exposed can leave the body colder than a firmer one that stays dry and interrupts contact with wet ground. That is why warmth and dryness may have shaped ancient sleeping choices more strongly than softness alone. In the modern world, many people judge a bed first by pressure relief. Does the shoulder sink enough? Does the back feel supported? Does the neck rest easily? Those questions are real, but they belong to a world where walls, floors, roofs, and controlled interiors already solve many environmental problems before the body even lies down. In much of human history, that larger protection was weaker, more temporary, or absent. Under those conditions, the surface under the body had to do several jobs at once. It had to reduce direct contact with cold earth, stay as dry as possible through the night, and work within the limits of the materials at hand. This is why even a thin barrier could matter. A layer of grass, reeds, leaves, hides, or other local matter may not have felt soft by modern standards, yet it could still create a meaningful difference by trapping some air, reducing moisture transfer, and breaking the body's most direct contact with the ground. That kind of change may sound small, but at night, small changes are often enough to decide whether the body slowly settles into sleep or keeps waking to cold. The logic is simple and widely accepted. The human body sleeps best within a limited thermal range, and both cold stress and dampness can disturb rest. So a sleeping place in earlier human life was not simply a surface. It was part of a heat management strategy. The same firm ground could feel very different depending on whether it was dry or wet, sheltered or exposed, lined or bare, near warmth or away from it. This is one reason fire mattered so much in ancient life, but also why fire alone was not the answer. A resting place too close to heat could bring smoke, sparks, or discomfort, while one too far away might leave the body chilled. The night therefore had to be arranged. People likely sought a balance between warmth, air, dryness, and available space. A good sleeping place was not necessarily the softest one in the area. It may have been the one that stayed dry after sunset, the one least touched by wind, or the one where simple material could be kept beneath the body without slipping away. This also explains why the title question should not be read as if ancient humans ignored bodily comfort. They were not choosing hardness for its own sake. They were often choosing between imperfect options, where thermal protection could matter more than pressure relief. A body can tolerate a fair amount of firmness if it remains warm enough, but even a softer place becomes difficult if it draws heat away all night. Once we understand that, the historical picture becomes calmer and more believable. Most of human history did not sleep on hard ground because hardness was preferred. It slept there because the sleeping world was organized around practical survival in real environments, and the first task of the night was often not softness, but keeping the body within a tolerable range of warmth and dryness. In that world, the ground remained present, while whatever thin layers people could gather served less as luxury than as insulation. That is the deeper shift this part makes. It asks the listener to see the ancient sleeping surface not as a failed mattress, but as a negotiated thermal space, where firmness was often accepted because the body needed something even more basic first, not to surrender too much of its heat before morning. Once warmth enters the story, the title of this video becomes easier to understand in a more human way. Most of human history did not sleep on hard ground because hardness was good. It slept there because the body was often solving a different problem first. A modern sleeper, protected by walls, roofing, raised floors, and stable bedding, can afford to judge the night mostly by comfort. But a sleeper in a colder, wetter, or less protected world had to judge the surface by a wider set of conditions. Was it dry? Was it sheltered from moving air? Did it hold some warmth? Could a layer of plant material or skin stay beneath the body? Could several people rest near each other without exposing themselves too much? These questions may have mattered before the body ever had the luxury of asking whether the ground felt soft. That does not make pressure disappear. A shoulder still presses. A hip still meets resistance. A back still notices unevenness. But when the environment itself is unstable, softness may become only one part of the decision, and not always the first. This is why a thin sleeping layer can be more important than it seems. A modest bed of grasses, reeds, leaves, fur, or other local material might do very little to create the kind of softness modern people expect. Yet, it could still change the night in more basic ways. It could reduce direct contact with damp soil. It could interrupt some heat loss. It could create a cleaner or drier patch of ground. It could make a familiar place easier to restore again the next evening. In that sense, many ancient sleeping surfaces may have functioned less like mattresses and more like minimal thermal barriers. Their value was practical before it was luxurious. This also helps explain why sleep in earlier human life was probably never just about one body and one surface. It was about arrangement. Shelter, fire, spacing, coverings, wind direction, local moisture, and proximity to others all shaped what the ground meant. A firm surface beside warmth and dryness might support deeper rest than a softer one exposed to cold and dampness. Even now, people can often tolerate firmness far better than chill. A body that stays warm enough can adapt to a surprising amount of imperfection, while a body losing heat through the night may keep waking no matter how soft the surface feels at first. That basic truth may have mattered for thousands upon thousands of years. It also keeps us from misunderstanding ancient life in a modern way. When we imagine the past, we tend to picture comfort as one scale running from hard to soft. But the older human night was organized by many scales at once. Dry or wet, warm or cold, exposed or sheltered, shared or alone, stable or shifting, near fire or too near, clean enough or fouled by use. On such a scale, hard ground was not always the worst option. It was often simply the base condition that people worked on, with whatever thin materials could improve it. Once that becomes clear, the title question stops sounding like a puzzle about toughness and starts sounding like a question about priorities. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Because the surface under the body was judged inside a larger environmental reality, and in that reality warmth and dryness could outweigh softness. The body did not need the night to feel perfect. It needed the night to remain tolerable long enough for sleep to happen at all. That may be the quiet lesson of this whole truck. The modern bed teaches us to think of comfort as something thick, stable, and guaranteed. The older human night suggests something narrower and more fragile. Comfort may often have meant only enough insulation, enough shelter, and enough relief from the ground to keep the body from losing too much heat before dawn. The earth still pressed upward, the body still noticed. But as long as the body remained warm enough, dry enough, and protected enough, that pressure could be endured. And for much of human history, enduring that pressure on a workable patch of ground may have been closer to normal than the deep softness many people now assume sleep has always required. Sleep is one of the most vulnerable things a human body does. As waking fades, awareness narrows, reaction slows, posture softens, and the body gives up some of the constant adjustment that protects it during the day. That simple fact helps explain why the sleeping place mattered for more than comfort alone. In a modern home, much of that vulnerability is managed before sleep even begins. Walls, doors, raised floors, stable light, and controlled interiors allow the body to let go more easily. But for most of human history, that protection was thinner. This does not mean every night was filled with immediate danger, and it does not mean early humans lived in constant fear of the dark, but it does mean that sleep had to be arranged in relation to exposure, because a sleeping body cannot respond to the world as quickly or as clearly as a waking one. That changes the meaning of the ground beneath it. A sleeping place did not only need to be dry enough or warm enough, it also needed to feel workable in relation to visibility, shelter, familiarity, and the presence of others. This is one reason sleep in human history was likely often social rather than solitary. A single body alone in darkness carries the full burden of the night by itself. A group does not erase vulnerability, but it changes how that vulnerability is distributed. One person shifts, another wakes briefly, another remains half aware for a moment, another adds warmth simply by being nearby. In that kind of setting, the value of a sleeping place may have depended less on softness than on whether it allowed bodies to remain close together in a stable and tolerable arrangement. Nearness mattered. Familiarity mattered. Shared warmth mattered. A place that kept people within the protective center of a camp or shelter may have been more valuable than a softer patch farther away. Once this enters the story, hard ground begins to look different. A relatively firm surface near others, near warmth, and inside a known arrangement may have been the better choice than a softer place that was more exposed, less dry, or less connected to the group. This does not mean the body stopped noticing pressure. A shoulder still pressed into the surface. A hip still felt resistance. A back still registered unevenness. But those sensations existed alongside other needs that could matter just as much, or more, once darkness deepened. The ancient sleeping place was not judged by one scale alone. It was judged by whether the body could surrender enough awareness to rest without drifting too far from warmth, shelter, and the people around it. Fire belongs to this story as well, though not in a dramatic way. Warmth from a hearth could change the quality of the night, but it also shaped where bodies could realistically settle, how space was shared, and how a sleeping surface was chosen. Too far from warmth could mean a colder and less tolerable night. Too close could create other discomforts. So the sleeping place was often part of a larger arrangement, not a private comfort decision made by one individual body. This is the quieter truth behind the title. Humans did not sleep on hard ground because they ignored vulnerability. They slept there because vulnerability had to be managed within the conditions available, and the best available place was often the one that balanced firmness with shelter, nearness, and order. The body at night needed more than softness. It needed a patch of the world that felt safe enough, warm enough, and familiar enough to let consciousness loosen its grip for a few hours. For much of human history, that patch remained close to the earth, and once we see that, the ground no longer looks like a simple failure of comfort. It looks like part of a larger human effort to make sleep possible inside a world that was never fully arranged around the sleeping body. A sleeping place in deep human history was never just a surface. It was part of a larger arrangement that allowed a vulnerable body to disappear into sleep without completely losing contact with warmth, shelter, and the group around it. That may be the most important idea to carry out of this truck. When modern people think about where to sleep, they often begin with personal comfort. Is it soft enough? Quiet enough? Private enough? But for much of human history, sleep was probably organized by a wider set of needs. A body at night is less alert, slower to respond, and less able to correct its position or react quickly to what changes around it. Under those conditions, the value of a sleeping place could not be measured only by pressure against the shoulder or hip. It also depended on whether the place remained dry enough, warm enough, close enough to others, and sheltered enough to make rest possible without leaving the sleeper too exposed. This is why a relatively firm patch of ground may often have been acceptable, even normal, when it belonged to a stable arrangement of human bodies, coverings, and shelter. The ground itself did not need to become comfortable in the modern sense. It only needed to be made tolerable within a larger system of protection. A place near familiar people could matter because it reduced isolation. A place near shared warmth could matter because it reduced cold. A place inside a known shelter or camp layout could matter because the body did not have to surrender itself to an unknown environment. These are not dramatic points, but they are probably closer to the truth than any image of ancient sleep as either fearless or miserable. Human rest was likely shaped by compromise. The body accepted a certain amount of firmness because softness was only one need among several, and often not the first one to be solved. Once that becomes clear, the title question starts to sound less like a puzzle about endurance and more like a question about priorities. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Because the human night was built around manageability, not perfection. The surface under the body could remain firm as long as the wider arrangement made the night workable. This also helps explain why the modern sleeping world feels so different. Today, many people sleep in spaces that isolate them from much of what earlier humans had to negotiate directly. The bed stands above the floor. The room closes against wind and weather. Privacy is expected. Bedding is designed to remove pressure, reduce disturbance, and make the body feel individually supported. That environment teaches the body to think of sleep as a personal event that should happen under highly controlled conditions. But the longer human story suggests that sleep was often less private, less specialized, and less separated from the group and the ground. It belonged to shared space. It belonged to arrangement. It belonged to the practical management of vulnerability. In such a world, the body may have learned to accept what modern sleepers quickly reject, not because it was a different body, but because the night asked different things of it. The ancient sleeper did not need the earth to disappear. The sleeper needed the earth to be tolerable enough within the shelter of other conditions. That is the quiet conclusion of this truck. Hard ground was not simply a sign of deprivation, and it was not a heroic test of toughness. It was often the ordinary base layer of a sleeping world in which protection came from nearness, familiarity, warmth, and shared arrangement more than from softness itself. The body still felt the firmness beneath it. It still turned, shifted, and negotiated with pressure through the night. But if the broader conditions were right enough, that firmness could be endured. And for most of human history, enduring it was not unusual. It was part of what sleep meant for a species that spent a very long time resting close to the earth, never fully alone, never fully sealed off, and never yet surrounded by the thick layers of comfort that now make the old human night so difficult to imagine. The same ground does not feel the same to every body. This may be one of the most important things to remember before we go any further. When we say that most of human history slept on hard ground, it is easy to imagine one shared human experience, as though the whole species met the night in roughly the same way. But that cannot have been true. A sleeping surface that one body can tolerate may trouble another almost immediately. Age changes the body. Injury changes it. Illness changes it. Pregnancy changes it. The demands of infancy, childhood, recovery, weakness, and old age all change what the ground means at night. So if the earlier parts of this story have asked how human beings could sleep on relatively firm surfaces for such a long time, this truck begins by asking a quieter and more human question. Which human beings are we talking about? A healthy adult in the middle of life is not the whole species. A child is lighter, still growing, and dependent on others for warmth, shelter, and arrangement. An older person may feel pressure more sharply, move less easily, or wake more often when the body must shift against discomfort. Someone carrying pain, weakness, or recent strain may not meet the same sleeping surface in the same way as a stronger body beside them. This does not need dramatic evidence to be believable. It follows from the ordinary fact that human bodies vary across the life course, and that sleep is always a meeting between body and surface, not a rule that applies equally to everyone. Once that is clear, the title begins to open up in a new direction. Most of human history may have slept on hard ground, but that does not mean hard ground was equally bearable for all members of a group. A place that worked for the camp as a whole may still have imposed different costs on different people within it. This matters because it helps us avoid one more oversimplification. The past was not populated only by strong adults in their physical prime. It also included infants who needed close contact, children whose bodies were still developing, women carrying or recovering from childbirth, elders living with accumulated wear, and people temporarily weakened by sickness or injury. All of them had to pass through the night somehow. The ground beneath them would have been the same ground in one sense, but not in the way it was felt. That likely means the sleeping world of the past had to include more variation and arrangement than the phrase hard ground first suggests. A group may have shared one general sleeping area, yet within that area bodies could still be placed differently. Nearer warmth, farther from drafts, closer to others, on slightly better prepared patches, on available coverings, or in positions shaped by care as much as by comfort. We do not need to invent detailed scenes to make this point. It is enough to recognize that human sleep has always been social, and social life changes how physical burdens are distributed. The weakest body in the group does not meet the night alone unless the whole structure of care has already failed. This also helps explain why the history of sleep cannot be told only through architecture or surfaces. It must also be told through dependency. A newborn cannot prepare its own resting place. A frail person may not be able to keep adjusting through the night as easily as a healthy adult. A child may sleep through closeness and warmth rather than through any ideal surface. In that sense, the question of hard ground is also a question of who was buffered from that hardness by other bodies, by shared materials, or by being placed in the best available position within a limited sleeping world. So this truck begins with a correction that is easy to miss. The ancient human night was not one experience repeated across identical bodies. It was a shared condition filtered through age, strength, dependency, and care. The ground remained close for nearly everyone, but it did not arrive equally. And once we see that, the story becomes both softer and more honest. Most of human history slept on hard ground, yes, but never as one body, always as many bodies at different stages of life, meeting the same earth through very different needs. If one of the quiet truths of this story is that human beings slept close to the ground for most of history, another is that they did not all meet that ground alone. A sleeping surface may be physically the same under a group, yet socially it can be very different from one body to the next. An infant does not lie down in the same way as an adult. A small child depends on warmth, placement, and closeness. An older person may need more time to settle, may wake more easily, or may feel the pressure of a firm surface more deeply in the joints, back, or hips. Someone weakened by injury or illness may not have the same freedom to change position through the night. These are simple human realities, but they matter because they shift the meaning of the title. Most of human history may have slept on hard ground, but hard ground was not one experience evenly distributed across all members of a group. Some bodies were buffered from it more than others, not because the ground changed, but because care changed the way the ground was encountered. This is where the sleeping world becomes more social than material. A child may sleep not because the surface is ideal, but because another body is near. Warmth is shared, contact is shared, protection is shared. A frail person may be placed in a slightly better position within a shelter, closer to the warm center, farther from moving air, or on the best available covering. Even when materials are limited, arrangement can still matter. It does not erase firmness, but it can soften its consequences. This is important because it keeps us from imagining the past as a uniform field of discomfort, where every person simply endured the same thing. Human groups have always had internal differences, and those differences shape the night. The strongest adult body is often the easiest one for modern imagination to picture, because it seems most able to tolerate rough conditions. But no real human community consists only of such bodies. Every group includes dependency. Children must be carried into sleep. Infants must be protected from cold and separation. Older bodies may need slower transitions and more stable placement. People recovering from strain or weakness may need the little advantages a sleeping area can offer. Once this enters the story, the question of where people slept becomes inseparable from how they lived together. The ground beneath them was still relatively hard by modern standards, but the experience of that hardness could be shaped by nearness, sequence, and care. One of the quietest forms of human adaptation may therefore have been not a special biological toughness, but the social distribution of discomfort. The group cannot always remove pressure from the body, but it can decide who lies where, who remains near warmth, who is placed towards shelter, and who is held within the center of the sleeping arrangement rather than at its edge. This also helps us understand why modern sleep can feel so different even when the surface itself is improved. Many people now sleep alone, on highly engineered beds, in spaces where comfort is individualized rather than shared. Earlier, human sleep was often less private and less specialized. It was built through proximity. In that world, some of the burden of the night may have been absorbed not by softness under the body, but by bodies around it. That does not mean ancient people were comfortable in some idealized sense. It means the human answer to hardship was often relational before it was technological. A firm surface could remain the base of the night while social life modified its effects. So this part of the story adds an important layer to the title. Most of human history slept on hard ground, but not in the same way, not with the same cost, and not without help. The earth remained near, yet between the body and that earth there could still be warmth, closeness, careful placement, and the small forms of protection that human groups give to those who cannot meet the night on equal terms. Once we see that, hard ground stops looking like one shared human condition and starts looking like a common surface filtered through age, weakness, dependence, and care. And that may be closer to the truth of the past than any image of a single, identical night repeated across everyone. The deeper we go into this question, the clearer it becomes that hard ground was never just a physical surface. It was also a test of how a human group carried difference within itself. The earth beneath a sleeping camp may have been broadly the same, but the bodies lying on it were not. Some were young and still growing, some were worn by age, Some were recovering from strain, childbirth, sickness, or injury. Some were small enough that warmth from others mattered as much as the ground beneath them. This means that the history of sleep cannot be told honestly as though one kind of body stood in for all the rest. A relatively healthy adult may be able to shift position, absorb discomfort, and settle into sleep on a firm surface with fewer consequences than someone whose body is weaker, older, or more dependent. That difference alone changes the meaning of the title. Most of human history may have slept on hard ground, but no group could have done so without constantly encountering the unequal burden that such ground placed on different lives. And once that becomes visible, another truth appears. The sleeping world of the past was likely shaped not only by material scarcity, but by quiet decisions about who needed the best available place most. Nearness to warmth, a slightly drier patch of earth, a better layer of covering, a more sheltered edge of the sleeping area, a position beside stronger or warmer bodies, a place farther from drafts or night air. All of these small differences could matter. None of them would have transformed the surface into modern comfort, but they could still change the night for someone who was less able to meet the ground on equal terms. This is one reason the phrase hard ground can mislead us if we hear it too simply. It suggests one condition when in reality there were many gradations inside the same sleeping space. The earth remained close for almost everyone, yet the effects of that closeness were softened, redistributed, or intensified according to age, strength, and the structure of care around the body. A baby held close to others does not meet the same night as an adult lying at the outer edge of a camp. An elder placed near warmth does not meet the same cold as someone farther from shelter. A weakened person whose movements are limited may depend more heavily on where they are placed before sleep even begins. In this way, the human response to hard ground was not only physical, it was social. People did not need to solve the problem completely in order to change it. They only needed to arrange themselves in ways that made the costs less equal. That may be one of the oldest forms of human protection. Before thick mattresses, before private bedrooms, before specialized furniture, there was still the possibility of ordering bodies in space, so that the most vulnerable did not always bear the full force of the night alone. This does not mean the past was gentle. It does not mean everyone was cared for equally, or that suffering was absent. But it does mean that sleep in human history was probably shaped as much by dependency and relationship as by the ground itself. The body at night has always been a biological body, but it has also always been a social body, held or not held within a network of warmth, placement, and shared burden. That is the quiet conclusion of this truck. Most of human history slept on hard ground, but the deeper reality is that people did not sleep on it as isolated individuals. They slept on it as children and elders, as the strong and the weak, as those who could adjust easily and those who could not, all within groups that had to decide, night after night, how to distribute comfort when there was never enough of it to go around. And perhaps that is why the ancient sleeping world feels so distant now. Not only because the ground was harder, but because the meaning of the ground depended so much on who was lying beside you, who was keeping you warm, and whether the group could turn one unforgiving surface into many different kinds of night. By the time humans began building more permanent settlements, the relationship between sleep and the ground started to change, but not all at once, and not everywhere in the same way. This is the first thing that matters in this truck. It would be misleading to imagine a sudden historical moment when people stopped sleeping on the earth and began sleeping in raised beds. The real change was slower, more uneven, and tied to larger shifts in how people lived. When groups settled for longer periods, built more durable shelters, stored more materials, and organized domestic space more clearly, new possibilities appeared. A floor could be maintained over time. A household could accumulate mats, textiles, skins, fibers, or wooden elements, instead of relying only on what was gathered that day. A sleeping place could become more stable because the place itself had become more stable. But even then, stability did not automatically mean softness in the modern sense. It first meant repetition. The same house, the same room, the same prepared surface, the same domestic materials, night after night. That alone was a major change in the history of sleep. The body no longer had to meet a newly improvised patch of ground each evening. It could begin to return to a known sleeping area shaped by walls, stored coverings, and a more predictable indoor environment. This is one reason early settled life matters so much to the title of the video. The bed did not appear simply because humans finally understood comfort. It emerged gradually as one consequence of sedentary life, domestic storage, woodworking, textile production, and the growing separation of household space into different functions. Once a community stays in one place long enough, the ground beneath sleep can be altered more deeply, floors can be leveled, platforms can be built, materials can be kept dry and reused. A place to rest can become something more than a temporary arrangement on top of the land. But it is important not to rush this story. For a very long time after permanent settlements began to appear in different parts of the world, many people still slept close to the ground. Mats, simple bedding, low platforms, packed earth floors, and modest raised surfaces likely coexisted across different households, classes, climates, and historical periods. The rise of domestic architecture did not immediately remove the earth from human sleep. It mostly changed how much control people could exercise over the sleeping surface. That distinction is important. The earliest steps away from hard ground were not necessarily steps toward luxury. They were often steps toward dryness, order, and repeatability. A raised surface could help separate the body from dampness, dirt, insects, or the cold pull of the floor. A maintained indoor sleeping place could reduce some of the uncertainty that came with more mobile life. But even with those improvements, the actual feel of sleep may still have remained relatively firm by modern expectations. This is why the history of beds should be told as a long transition, not a simple invention. The ground remained central for much of the story, even inside buildings. In many times and places, what changed first was not softness but distance. The body began, slowly, to move a little farther from the earth. That movement required labor, material surplus, and a social world capable of dedicating resources to domestic comfort beyond immediate survival. Not every household could do that equally. Not every society moved in that direction at the same pace, and not every raised sleeping place would have felt especially soft. Still, something important had begun. Sleep was becoming more architectural. It was being drawn into a human-made interior more fully than before. The night was no longer shaped only by terrain, weather, and temporary arrangement. It was increasingly shaped by the house, by stored materials, and by the ability to remake the same resting place again and again. So this truck begins the next stage of the story carefully. Humans did not suddenly leave hard ground behind. They slowly created the conditions under which sleep could become less dependent on the immediate earth beneath them. Permanent settlement did not instantly produce modern comfort, but it did make possible a new idea of the night, that rest could happen in a place prepared in advance, preserved over time, and increasingly separated from the raw surface of the land. Once people began living for longer periods inside built spaces, sleep entered a new kind of history. The change was not only material, it was also spatial. In a mobile world, the sleeping place had to be made again and again out of what the evening allowed. In a settled world, the same patch of interior could be used repeatedly, adjusted slowly, and remembered by the body over time. That may seem like a small shift, but it changes the meaning of rest. A body that returns each night to a familiar corner, a maintained floor, or a known sleeping surface, is no longer negotiating with the land in quite the same way. The environment has begun to hold its shape across days, seasons, and years. Floors can be packed, repaired, swept, or covered. Mats and textiles can be stored instead of improvised. Wood can be reused. Domestic space can become more divided, with some areas more suited to rest than others. This is where the history of the bed begins to make sense, not as a sudden breakthrough in comfort, but as part of a larger transition in human life toward permanence, storage, and repeated control over the same interior. Yet the distance between that transition and the modern sleeping world is still very large. It is important not to read too much softness into the first steps away from the ground. A maintained indoor floor is still a floor. A mat is not a mattress. A low platform is not necessarily cushioned. A raised sleeping place may protect the body from dampness, dirt, insects, and some of the pull of cold ground, but it does not automatically create the thick, pressure-relieving comfort that modern people now associate with a bed. This is one reason the title of the video remains true even as the story changes. Most of human history may have slept on hard ground, not because houses did not exist, but because even when houses did exist, the sleeping surface often remained relatively firm by present standards. The change was gradual because it depended on more than a simple idea. To move sleep farther from the earth required materials, labour, craft knowledge, and enough domestic surplus to support objects used mainly for rest. That kind of change does not spread evenly. Some households could accumulate better coverings or build better platforms than others. Some climates made certain materials more available. Some forms of architecture encouraged more separation between body and floor. Others did not. So the history of sleeping surfaces in settled life was likely uneven from the beginning. Better sleeping arrangements appeared, but they did not erase older ones all at once. Ground-level sleep, mats, packed earth floors, and simple raised surfaces could all coexist within the same broad period of history, and often within the same society. This unevenness matters because it keeps the story honest. Human settlement did not rescue the species from hard ground in one clean movement. It created the possibility of more control, but possibility is not the same as universal transformation. Even once people had houses, much depended on wealth, climate, material culture, and how domestic labour was organised. What changed first, in many places, may have been not softness but predictability. The body could return to a sleeping place already known, already partly prepared, already somewhat separated from the raw landscape outside. That is a major shift in itself. The night began to belong more to the household and less directly to the terrain. Sleep became less mobile, less improvised, and more architectural, but it still remained close enough to the earth that firmness continued to define the experience for most people. So this part of the story adds a new layer without breaking the old one. Settlement changed sleep by making it more stable, repeatable, and human-shaped. It allowed the sleeping place to become a lasting feature of domestic life rather than a temporary arrangement remade each night. But it did not immediately turn rest into softness. The body was moving, slowly, into a world where the ground could be managed more deeply. Yet for a very long time that management still stopped well short of what a modern sleeper would recognize as true cushioning. In that sense, the house did not end the age of hard ground. It only began the long process of placing more and more human design between the body and the earth. The longer humans remained in one place, the more sleep could be shaped by household life instead of by the immediate conditions of the land outside. That is the quiet turning point at the center of this truck. In a mobile world, the sleeping place was often part of an evening arrangement made from whatever the camp, shelter, or landscape could offer at that moment. In a settled world, the sleeping place could begin to persist. It could belong to a room, a corner, a platform, a maintained floor, or a set of coverings kept for repeated use. This did not mean the human body suddenly entered the modern bedroom. It meant that sleep was slowly becoming something more durable, more spatially defined, and more shaped by stored materials and repeated labour. That difference matters because it helps explain how the long history of hard ground began to loosen without disappearing all at once. Once a household can maintain the same interior over time, small improvements become more meaningful. A floor can be levelled again and again. A mat can be rolled out repeatedly. A low sleeping platform can be repaired rather than rebuilt from nothing. Coverings can be dried, stored, and reused. The body begins to return not just to a place, but to a prepared place. This changes the experience of night even when the surface remains relatively firm. Familiarity itself has value. A known sleeping area inside a stable shelter reduces some of the uncertainty that shaped earlier forms of rest. The body does not have to negotiate a newly chosen patch of terrain every evening. It can settle into a space already partly organized around human use. And yet the deeper truth of the title still holds. For a long time, even this more organized sleeping world remained much closer to the earth than modern intuition suggests. The earliest and most widespread steps away from ground-level sleep were often modest. A packed floor is still hard. A mat may soften contact only slightly. A low platform may raise the body without greatly changing pressure. Even a more elaborate sleeping surface in an early settled household would usually have remained far firmer and less uniform than a modern mattress. This is why the history of the bed should be imagined less as an invention and more as a slow thickening of distance between body and ground. First came stability, then repetition, then the possibility of stored coverings, maintained surfaces and raised structures. Only much later, in more uneven and socially limited ways, did sleep begin to acquire the thicker softness that many people now treat as normal. This slow pace also reminds us that settlement did not benefit everyone equally. Domestic space is never just a technical achievement. It is also shaped by labour, wealth, status, climate, and custom. Some people would have had better access to coverings or raised surfaces than others. Some households could devote more material to comfort. Others could not. So even within settled societies, many people likely continued to sleep on surfaces that remained close to the ground in both height and feel. The history of sleep after settlement is therefore not a clean replacement of one world by another. It is an overlapping world where the house expands human control over the night but does not immediately create universal comfort. That is the quiet conclusion of this truck. Humans did not stop sleeping on hard ground simply because they began to build houses. What changed was that the ground itself became more manageable. It could be enclosed, maintained, covered, and sometimes raised away from. The sleeping place became more repeatable, more domestic, and more visibly shaped by human intention, but the body still remained for a very long time in contact with surfaces that were firm by modern standards. So if the earlier chapters of this story were about a species sleeping close to the earth because it lived close to the earth, this chapter shows the beginning of a new possibility. The earth did not disappear from human sleep. It was slowly mediated by architecture, stored materials, and domestic habit. And that slow mediation, unevenly spread across generations and households, is how the long age of hard ground began to give way, not all at once, but little by little, to a more separated and more human-made night. By the time beds became recognizable objects in human history, they still did not mean what a modern bed means now. This is one of the easiest places to misunderstand the past. The word bed can make the mind jump too quickly towards softness, thickness, and the kind of pressure relief that many people now expect as normal. But in much of history, a bed often meant something simpler and more practical. A place lifted somewhat from the ground, a frame, a platform, a woven surface, a mat, or a structured sleeping area that changed the body's relation to dirt, dampness, insects, cold floors, and household space. That change could be important without creating anything close to a modern mattress. A raised surface does not automatically become a soft one. It first becomes a separated one. This distinction matters because the title of the video can otherwise be misunderstood. Most of human history may have slept on hard ground, and even after beds began to appear in some societies, many people were still sleeping on surfaces that remained relatively firm by present standards. The great historical shift was not instantly from hard to soft. It was first from ground to structure. Once that happens, the body is no longer meeting the earth in exactly the same way. The sleeper is lifted somewhat above dampness. Air may move differently beneath the surface. The sleeping place may stay cleaner, drier, and more defined within the household. Yet the feeling of the body against that surface could still remain taut, narrow, or resistant, especially if the support came from wood, woven fibers, cords, reeds, or thin coverings rather than deep padding. This is why beds in the historical sense should be treated as part of a long transition, not as the end of the old story. They often changed hygiene, dryness, and order before they changed softness in any dramatic way. A structured sleeping surface could help organize domestic life. It could mark where rest belonged. It could separate sleep from work, cooking, and traffic through a room. It could also reflect status, because objects that require time, craft, materials, and indoor space are never distributed equally. But none of those things guarantee comfort as a modern sleeper would define it. A woven bed can sag or tighten. A wooden support can remain hard beneath thin layers. A mat can be portable and useful without being deeply cushioned. Even where historical households possess beds, the actual experience of lying down may still have involved a body negotiating firmness rather than sinking into softness. This matters because it keeps the title grounded in a very long timeline. The modern imagination often compresses history into two worlds, before the bed and after the bed. But the real human story is slower. For most of history, even improvements in sleeping technology often remained modest by modern standards. A person could sleep above the floor and still sleep firmly. A person could have a designated sleeping place and still feel the pressure of structure beneath them. A person could lie on a bed and yet remain far closer to the old world of taut, simple support than to anything now sold as plush or ergonomic. In that sense, the bed did not immediately erase the memory of the ground. It carried some of the ground upward with it. The surface became more human-made, more domestic, more repeatable, but not necessarily much softer. That may be the most useful way to enter this truck. The question is not when beds were invented, as though invention itself solved the night. The deeper question is what changed first when humans began to sleep on structures rather than directly on the earth. The safest answer is that height, separation, and order often came before deep comfort. The body was moving farther from dampness and disorder, but not yet into the fully cushioned world that many people now assume has always been the goal of sleep. So this chapter begins with a simple correction. A bed in history was often a framework for sleeping, not yet a guarantee of softness. And once that is understood, the old title remains more true than it first appears. Even after beds entered human life, much of humanity still slept on surfaces firm enough that the ancient relationship between body and resistance had by no means disappeared. A historical bed often changed the location of sleep more than it changed its feel. This is the important step to hold on to here. Once a body is raised from the floor, even slightly, many things can improve without the surface becoming truly soft. The sleeper may be farther from damp ground, less exposed to dirt and crawling insects, more clearly placed within the household, and more easily surrounded by coverings that remain dry and usable from one night to the next. These are real improvements. They matter for comfort, for cleanliness, and for the practical ordering of domestic life. But they do not necessarily produce the deep softness that modern people often imagine when they hear the word bed. In many historical settings, a bed could consist of wood, rope, woven fibre, reeds, cords, mats, or layered textiles stretched across a frame or placed on a raised support. Such structures could lift the body and organize the sleeping space while still feeling taut, narrow, uneven, or firm. A sleeper might gain separation from the earth without gaining the kind of pressure relief that now feels normal on a modern mattress. This is one reason the history of sleep should not be told as a sudden victory of comfort over hardship. The earliest and most common improvements were often about control rather than softness. A household that could keep a bed frame, a platform, or a dedicated sleeping surface was beginning to control where rest happened and what separated the body from the floor. That control had many advantages. It made the sleeping place more stable. It made domestic space more ordered. It allowed coverings and sleeping materials to be stored, reused, and better protected. But the body still met resistance. The shoulder still needed somewhere to settle. The hips still pressed downward. The back still depended on a support system that could be tight, flat, or only lightly covered. This is why so much of historical sleep likely remained closer to the old world of firmness than modern imagination tends to admit. A bed frame alone does not create softness. It only creates structure, and structure can be helpful even when it remains hard. It can reduce dampness, define personal or household space, and make a place for sleep more repeatable from night to night. In this sense, the rise of beds in history belongs to the larger movement by which sleep became more domestic, more architectural, and more separated from the raw ground beneath human life. But that separation was still incomplete. In many times and places, people who technically slept on beds may have experienced nights that were still firm enough to feel familiar to earlier generations. The earth had not disappeared from human rest so much as been translated into wood, fibre, frame, and tension. That is a slower and more interesting change than the simple idea that beds appeared and comfort arrived. It also helps explain why sleep technologies spread unevenly. A bed requires materials, craft, space, and maintenance. Some households had more of these than others. Some could build more stable and elaborate sleeping structures. Others remained closer to mats, floors, and simpler forms of rest. So even in societies where beds existed, many people likely still slept in ways that remained materially modest. The history of the bed is therefore not just the history of invention, it is the history of how much distance different people could place between their bodies and the ground. And for a long time, that distance remained small. This is the deeper point of this part. A bed in history often meant that sleep had become more organized, more elevated, and more clearly separated from the everyday floor of the house. But it did not yet mean the body entered the fully cushioned world that modern sleep has made familiar. Much of humanity continued to rest on surfaces that, while raised and structured, were still firm enough to preserve an older relationship between the sleeping body and resistance. So the title of this video remains intact even here. The ground may have begun to disappear from sight, but hardness did not disappear with it. It simply changed form, moving upward into the structures humans built to place themselves a little farther from the earth, though not yet far enough to escape its pressure completely. The deeper history of the bed is not the history of softness arriving all at once. It is the history of a long and uneven separation between the body and the ground. That is the quiet conclusion of this truk. Once beds became part of domestic life, they changed many things before they changed the feel of sleep in the modern sense. They could raise the body above dirt and dampness. They could create a clearer place for rest within the house. They could make sleep more stable, more repeatable, and more protected from some of the immediate discomforts of the floor. But none of that required thick padding. None of it required the kind of engineered surface that modern people now expect to receive the body gently, spread weight evenly, and reduce pressure at every point of contact. For much of history, even when people no longer slept directly on the earth, they were still sleeping on supports that remained taut, simple, and relatively firm. In that sense, the first great achievement of the bed was not softness, it was distance. The body was lifted, the ground was lowered, but the old experience of resistance still remained. This matters because the title of the video is easiest to understand when we stop imagining history as two separate worlds, one before beds and one after them. The real story is slower. A raised platform, a woven surface, a layer of cloth over wood, a mat placed on a frame. All of these can count as real steps away from direct ground sleep, yet still leave the body negotiating firmness through the night. A shoulder can still ache. A hip can still search for a better angle. A sleeper can still turn and readjust in response to a surface that gives only a little. The fact that a bed exists does not mean the ancient relationship between body and hard support has disappeared. It may simply have been reorganized into a more domestic and controlled form. This is also why the history of beds cannot be separated from the history of inequality. The more material, labor, and storage a household possesses, the more it can shape the sleeping place. Better coverings, better frames, more stable interiors, and more specialized domestic objects all depend on resources. So even in societies where beds were known, many people would still have slept on modest surfaces, simple mats, low platforms, or structures that offered height without much softness. The existence of beds in a society does not mean that most people slept in luxury. It often means only that the possibility of greater separation from the ground had appeared unevenly, for some more than for others. This unevenness matters because it keeps the story honest. Sleep technology does not spread instantly, and comfort does not arrive equally. One household may lie on woven support covered with stored textiles, while another remains much nearer to floor-level sleeping. One body may gain a clearer domestic place for rest, while another still depends on the older arrangements of mat, platform, or packed indoor surface. Across all these differences, the broader pattern still holds. Human sleep was moving upward and inward, becoming more architectural and more intentionally organized. But the body was still far from the fully cushioned world that many people now treat as natural. That is why this truk matters so much to the larger argument of the video. It shows that even after the bed entered history, the memory of hard ground did not vanish. It survived inside the bed itself, inside its firmness, its tension, its thin coverings, its limited give. The body had begun to leave the earth, but not yet to float free from resistance. So the final point here is not that beds changed nothing. They changed a great deal. They altered hygiene, space, order, and the very idea that sleep could belong to a designated structure rather than to the floor beneath daily life. But they did not instantly turn the night soft. For a very long time, humans slept not on bare ground, but on constructions that still carried much of the ground's logic upward into the house. And that may be the most accurate bridge between the old world and the new one. The bed did not immediately erase hard sleep. It slowly translated hard sleep into a more human-made form, leaving the body, across many generations, still resting against a surface that resisted it more than many modern sleepers now remember, is possible. By the time we reach the modern world, the sleeping surface has changed, but so has the body that arrives there. This is an important shift, because it is easy to assume that the story of sleep is only a story about beds becoming softer over time. In reality, the daily life that leads into sleep has also changed profoundly. For much of human history, many people spent large parts of the day walking, carrying, bending, squatting, kneeling, rising from the ground, and adjusting continuously to uneven terrain. Their bodies moved through a wide range of positions before night even began. In many modern settings, the pattern is different. Long hours are spent sitting in chairs, travelling in vehicles, working at desks, and living on flat, controlled indoor surfaces. This does not mean modern life is simply worse, and it does not mean the past was healthier in every respect. But it does mean that the body now often reaches bedtime through a narrower range of movement than bodies did in many earlier forms of life. That difference may matter more than it first appears. Sleep is not separate from the day that comes before it. A body that has spent many hours in one repeated posture may meet the bed differently from a body that has been changing position all day. Stiffness, compression, muscle fatigue, and the sense of needing a very particular kind of support may all be shaped partly by how the waking body has been used. This helps explain why modern sleepers can feel deeply dependent on a controlled sleeping surface. The issue may not be softness alone. It may also be that the body arrives at night already shaped by hours of limited movement, indoor predictability, and furniture designed to hold it in similar ways again and again. In that sense, the modern bed is answering a modern day as much as it is answering an ancient body. This is a careful point, because it should not be pushed too far. We should not claim that earlier humans slept well simply because they moved more, or that modern discomfort is only a product of sitting. Human sleep has always been vulnerable to stress, age, illness, pain, cold, noise, and many other disturbances. But it remains reasonable to say that changes in daily movement patterns have likely changed what the body expects when it finally lies down. A body accustomed to frequent posture changes may tolerate firmness differently from a body that has been held in repeated sitting positions for much of the day. This does not require a different anatomy. It only requires a different routine. Once that becomes visible, the title of the video begins to change shape again. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Perhaps partly because daily life kept the body in a closer relationship with the ground long before sleep began. The body knelt, crouched, rose, carried, and rested in ways that did not make the floor seem like a foreign surface encountered only at night. In much of modern life, the opposite can be true. The floor is something many adults spend surprisingly little time touching directly. Chairs, beds, sofas, and shoes keep the body lifted, supported, and buffered for most of the day. So when night comes, the expectation of managed support is already deeply established. The bed does not feel like a luxury added to life. It feels like a continuation of the day's arrangement. That may be one reason modern sleep can feel so dependent on a narrow band of conditions. The body is not only asking for rest, it is asking for the continuation of an environment it has barely left since morning, and that may be one of the quietest distances between us and the long human past. Earlier humans did not simply sleep on harder surfaces. They likely lived on harder surfaces too, in the broad sense that daily life demanded more contact with ground, variation, and physical adjustment. So this truck begins with a simple but important suggestion. The softness many people now feel they need at night may not be explained only by the history of beds. It may also be explained by the history of days. The modern sleeping body does not arrive untouched by modern life. It carries the chair, the floor, the desk, the vehicle, and the enclosed room into bed with it. And because of that, the distance between us and hard ground may begin long before we close our eyes. The modern body often arrives at sleep already partially arranged by furniture before it even reaches the bed. This is one of the quieter changes in the long history of human rest. Many people now spend the day moving from one design support to another, chair to car seat to desk chair to sofa, sofa to bed. The body is still working, still tiring, still carrying stress and effort, but it is doing so within a world that continually holds it off the ground and shapes the angles of its joints in repeated ways. This matters because tiredness alone does not decide how a body meets sleep. The pattern of support during waking life matters too. A person who has spent many hours in limited positions may reach the night feeling not only fatigue, but also a very specific need for release in the hips, lower back, neck, and shoulders. The bed then becomes more than a place to sleep. It becomes the first place where the body expects those accumulated pressures to be answered. That may help explain why many modern sleepers feel unusually sensitive to small imperfections in the sleeping surface. A mattress that is too firm, too soft, too warm, too uneven, or slightly unfamiliar can seem to interrupt sleep before sleep even begins. This is not because the body has become weak in any simple sense. It is because the body has been taught all day to expect managed support, and at night it expects an even more precise version of that support. Earlier human lives were often organized differently. Without romanticizing them, it is still reasonable to say that many people in the past moved through a wider range of postures and surfaces during ordinary life. They rose from the ground more often, crouched more often, sat differently, walked more, and adjusted more continuously to terrain and task. That does not guarantee good sleep, and it certainly does not erase pain, injury, age, or hardship. But it may mean that the body did not arrive at night from the same kind of repeated, highly managed support system that many modern bodies now take for granted. In such a world, the ground was not encountered only as a failure of comfort at bedtime. It was part of the whole day. That difference may be crucial. The sleeping surface always feels different depending on what came before it. A body that has spent 12 or 14 waking hours being held in fairly narrow patterns may need the bed to undo something. A body that has spent the day changing posture more freely may ask less of the surface, not because it feels less, but because its expectations have been formed differently. This is why the title question begins to shift again once we bring modern daily life into view. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Perhaps not only because softer options were absent, but also because the body's relationship to firmness began long before night. The same species that slept close to the earth also lived close to it. Today, many people live most of the day buffered from direct contact with the ground, then ask the bed to complete that buffering at the exact moment of rest. The bed becomes the final layer in a chain of separation that has already lasted since morning. That does not make modern comfort false or unnecessary. It only makes it historical. It suggests that what now feels natural may actually be the result of a very recent alliance between the body and built support. The mattress is not meeting a timeless human form. It is meeting a body already shaped by indoor surfaces, repeated sitting, and a day organized around prolonged support. So this part of the story adds something subtle but important. The modern dependence on a carefully tuned sleeping surface may not come only from the bed itself. It may come from the way the entire day prepares the body to need that bed. And if that is true, then the distance between us and hard ground is not measured only in mattresses. It is measured in chairs, floors, routines, architecture, and the slow redesign of daily life that has made the body less familiar with unmanaged surfaces long before sleep begins. The deeper difference between the modern sleeper and the older human sleeper may not be found in the bed alone, but in the entire shape of life that leads toward the bed. This is the quiet conclusion of this truk. Over time, human sleep has not only become softer, it has become more specialized, more separated from the ground, and more dependent on a daily world built to support the body in advance. Many people now live most of their waking hours inside controlled interiors, moving across flat floors, sitting on designed furniture, traveling in padded seats, and spending long stretches of time in positions that change less often than they once did for much of human history. By the time night arrives, the body has already spent the day being held up, guided, and buffered from rough contact with the environment. The bed then appears not as a dramatic exception, but as the final and most refined version of that same support. It receives a body already shaped by indoor life and repeated posture, a body that may feel tired in a very specific modern way. The shoulders may carry the stillness of desk work, the hips may carry the narrow geometry of chairs, the lower back may carry the long persistence of sitting, the neck may carry hours of fixed visual attention. Under those conditions, a sleeping surface is asked to do more than hold the body through the night. It is asked to undo the day. That may be one reason so many people now feel that they need a very particular kind of mattress, pillow, temperature, and support in order to sleep well. The requirement is not only biological, it is historical. It belongs to a body that has been spending the day in an environment where support is continuous and highly managed. Earlier human lives, by contrast, were often lived in closer contact with variation. Without idealizing the past, it is still reasonable to say that daily movement, posture, and contact with the ground were often more diverse than they are in many modern settings. A body that kneels, squats, walks, bends, rises from the ground, and adjusts repeatedly to terrain may still become tired, sore, injured, or cold. But it does not arrive at night through the same long corridor of chairs, vehicles, desks, and enclosed stillness. Its relationship to firmness begins earlier and continues more continuously. That may help explain why hard ground, while never necessarily comfortable, could remain normal for so much of human history. The body was not meeting an alien surface at bedtime. It was meeting a world it had already touched all day. In the modern world, the opposite can often be true. The floor is distant, the body is lifted, support is expected, and when support is imperfect, discomfort can feel immediate and strangely personal, as though something has gone wrong not only with the bed, but with rest itself. This does not mean the past was better, and it does not mean modern comfort is false. It means only that comfort has a history, and the body's idea of what is necessary at night has likely been shaped by what the body has been allowed to expect all day. That may be the most useful lesson of this entire trek. Most of human history slept on hard ground not simply because soft surfaces were unavailable, but because the whole rhythm of life kept human beings closer to unmanaged surfaces from morning to night. The modern sleeper lives inside another rhythm. By evening, the body has already been trained by architecture, furniture, and routine to seek controlled relief. The bed answers that training. It becomes the place where the day finally releases its grip, and perhaps that is why the ancient human night now feels so far away. Not only because the ground was harder, but because the body that met that ground had been formed by a different day, a different range of movement, and a different relationship to support itself. The distance between us and hard ground, then, is not only the distance created by mattresses, it is the distance created by modern life as a whole, and by the many invisible layers of support that now shape the body long before sleep begins. What many people now call comfort at night is not just a feeling, it is also a cultural achievement, and a surprisingly recent one when placed against the full length of human history. This is where the story begins to turn inward. A soft bed can feel so normal that it seems almost biological, as though the human body had always been waiting for exactly this arrangement and only recently received what it was naturally owed. But history suggests a different picture. The conditions many people now associate with proper sleep, softness, dryness, warmth, privacy, predictable quiet, a raised surface, clean coverings, stable indoor temperature, and a room organized mainly for rest did not arrive all at once, and for most of human history, they did not exist together in anything like a standard form. That matters because it changes the meaning of discomfort. A body lying awake on a hard or unfamiliar surface today may feel that something essential is missing. And in one sense, something is missing, but what is missing may not be an eternal requirement of the species. It may be a complex bundle of material expectations built slowly through architecture, textile production, furniture, domestic labor, heating, flooring, and the long development of household life. In that sense, modern comfort is not false, but it is historical. It had to be made. This is important because the title of the video can otherwise sound too simple, as if most of human history slept on hard ground, merely because it had not yet discovered the obvious value of softness. But softness alone is only one part of what modern people now mean by restful sleep. A modern bed is part of a whole environment that protects the body from the wider world. The floor is dry, the room is enclosed, the bedding is stored and maintained, the sleeping place belongs to the individual or household, and can often be returned to in nearly the same condition every night. This predictability changes the body's expectations. It teaches the sleeper that rest should happen within a narrow band of conditions, and that deviations from those conditions count as problems. Earlier human life, by contrast, often treated sleep less as a private state of optimized comfort and more as a tolerable pause within the larger demands of existence. This does not mean people in the past did not value comfort. Of course they did. in whatever forms were available to them. But the threshold for what counted as a workable night was likely shaped by a world in which materials were more limited, domestic space less specialized, and softness more temporary, partial, and unevenly distributed. Once we recognize that, modern comfort begins to look less like nature and more like infrastructure. It depends on many hidden layers: the labor that cleans and maintains the sleeping place, the industry that produces fabrics and filling, the built environment that keeps moisture out, the heating or insulation that stabilizes temperature, and the expectation that one body deserves a carefully prepared place to spend the least conscious hours of the day. That expectation is powerful, but it is also young. For much of human history, sleep remained closer to the earth not because people were indifferent to ease, but because ease itself existed in narrower forms. A mat, a skin, a low platform, a better indoor floor, a drier corner, a place nearer warmth, these were meaningful improvements, even if they did not create the smooth, pressure-relieving softness now widely imagined as normal. So this trick begins with a quiet correction to the modern imagination. What feels natural at night may in fact be the product of many historical layers becoming so familiar that they no longer look historical at all. The soft bed, the controlled room, the private sleeping space, the idea that rest should be individually tailored and physically forgiving. None of these should be treated as timeless human defaults. They are real achievements, but they are achievements nonetheless. And once we see that, the title becomes deeper again. Most of human history slept on hard ground, not simply because it lacked the bed, but because the whole system required to turn sleep into a reliably soft, protected, and highly managed experience had not yet fully formed. Comfort becomes hardest to see when it has become ordinary. A person lies down each night on a soft surface, under clean coverings, inside a room built to keep out wind, dampness, and interruption. And after enough years, this arrangement stops feeling historical. It begins to feel like the natural shape of human rest. That may be one reason the title of this video can sound so strange at first. Why would most of human history sleep on hard ground if the body so clearly prefers something gentler? But that question already contains a modern assumption. It assumes that what feels normal now must always have been the standard by which sleep should be judged. The deeper historical picture suggests something else. The sleeping comfort many people now expect is not one invention. It is the accumulation of many separate changes that slowly came together. Softer materials had to be produced and kept dry. Floors had to become more stable and insulated. Indoor spaces had to become more separate from weather and dirt. Domestic labor had to maintain bedding and sleeping rooms over time. Furniture had to become common enough to shape ordinary life, not only the lives of the wealthy. Privacy had to grow as an expectation. Quiet had to become something that could be organized rather than merely hoped for. Even temperature, which now disappears into the background in many homes, had to be controlled more consistently for sleep to feel reliably comfortable. When these layers combine, the result feels simple. A person says the bed is comfortable, but beneath that sentence is a long history of architecture. Textiles, storage, labor, heating, household routine, and the growing belief that rest should happen in a carefully protected environment. This matters because it changes the way we think about the past. Earlier humans did not necessarily live without comfort. They lived with a narrower version of it. A dry sleeping place could be comfortable relative to a wet one. A sheltered corner could be comfortable relative to exposure. A layer of plant material or skins could be comfortable relative to direct contact with cold ground. A raised platform could be comfortable relative to a dirt floor. In other words, comfort has always existed by degrees. What changed over time was not the existence of comfort, but its thickness, stability, and availability. Modern sleep often expects many advantages at once. The ancient or pre-modern sleeper often had to work with partial improvements that solved one problem while leaving several others untouched. This is why the modern idea of comfort can be misleading when projected backward. It makes the past look like a single long absence, when in reality it was full of smaller gains that mattered deeply within the limits of their world. A woven mat may not feel luxurious to a modern body, yet in its own setting it could represent dryness, order, and relief. A low bed frame may not feel soft, yet it could mark a meaningful separation from dampness and dirt. A warmer room may not be silent or private, but it could still transform the night. Once we see comfort this way, the title begins to settle into place. Most of human history slept on hard ground, not because humans failed to value ease, but because the kind of ease now taken for granted required many systems to exist together at once. Those systems emerged slowly, unevenly, and never for everyone at the same time. So this part of the story asks the listener to notice something quiet but important. When a modern sleeper says, "This bed feels right," the body may be responding not only to softness, but to an entire civilization of support hidden inside that softness. The room, the fabric, the dryness, the stored warmth, the predictability, the repeated care, all of it is present even when unnoticed. And perhaps that is why hard ground now feels so distant. It is not only that the surface changed, it is that comfort itself became layered, organized, and expected in ways so complete that we rarely remember how recent those expectations really are. By the end of this story, comfort no longer looks simple. It does not look like a natural baseline that humans finally discovered, and it does not look like a luxury added on top of an otherwise complete biological design. It looks historical. It looks built. It looks like a long accumulation of materials: architecture, labor, storage, heating, domestic order, and social expectation that gradually taught the body to expect a very narrow kind of night. That may be the quiet conclusion of this truck. For most of human history, people did not sleep without any comfort at all. They slept within forms of comfort that were thinner, less stable, less private, and far less protected from the wider environment than what many modern sleepers now consider normal. A dry place could be better than a wet one. A sheltered place could be better than an exposed one. A layer of grass, reeds, or skins could be better than direct contact with cold ground. A low platform could be better than the floor beneath it. A room with maintained coverings could be better than a temporary arrangement remade each evening. In every age, human beings worked to improve the night, but for a very long stretch of time, those improvements remained partial. They solved some problems while leaving others in place. The modern sleeping world is different, not because it invented comfort from nothing, but because it gathers so many forms of comfort together at once that they begin to feel invisible. Softness, dryness, warmth, privacy, repeatability, cleanliness, reduced noise, controlled light, a stable surface, and a room largely given over to rest now often arrive as one bundle. The body meets this bundle so regularly that it can mistake it for nature itself. Yet when that bundle is removed, even partly, the reaction can be immediate. A hotel bed feels wrong. A floor feels impossible. A room too warm or too cold can undo the night. A little noise feels intrusive. A thin mat feels inadequate. These reactions are real, but they are also historical. They come from a body that has been trained, quietly and continuously, by a world in which sleep has become highly managed. That is why the title of this video leads somewhere deeper than the surface of the bed. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Because the thick system that now protects the sleeping body had not yet fully formed. The human species existed for an immense span of time before the house became thermally stable, before bedding became widely abundant, before domestic interiors became specialized, before furniture lifted most bodies well away from the earth, and before comfort became something many people could reasonably expect every night. Hard ground, in that larger sense, was not just a surface. It was the ordinary baseline of a world in which rest remained close to weather, close to material scarcity, close to group life, and close to the earth itself. The modern sleeper, by contrast, lives inside a different idea of night. Rest has become individual, buffered, layered, and in many places highly protected. That change should not be dismissed. It has real value. It reduces cold, dampness, dirt, and many forms of interruption. It gives the body relief that earlier humans often could not secure so reliably. But it also changes memory. It makes older conditions harder to imagine and easier to judge as simply wrong. Perhaps that is the most important lesson here. The body we call natural may already be living inside comforts too recent to feel recent. The bed beneath us may seem ordinary, only because history has hidden itself so well inside it. And once that becomes visible, the old title stops sounding like a strange fact about the past. It starts sounding like a quiet reminder that what feels essential now may actually be the newest layer in a much older human story, one in which the earth remained near for far longer than modern comfort allows us to easily remember. If we step back from the details, the question in the title begins to look less like a puzzle about the past and more like a mirror held up to the present. Most of human history slept on hard ground, not because people preferred it, and not because the body was designed to seek it out, but because for a very long time the conditions required to build a consistently soft, dry, insulated, and protected sleeping environment did not yet exist together in one place. That is the safest conclusion to carry into this final truck. It does not depend on speculation. It follows from what we have already seen across environment, archaeology, biology, settlement, and material culture. The human body has always needed rest, but the form that rest takes has always depended on what the surrounding world can provide. For most of the human past, that world remained materially close to the ground. People could improve the surface, choose better places, arrange materials, share warmth, and build shelters, but the distance between body and earth remained small. Over time, that distance grew, not all at once, and not for everyone, but gradually, through architecture, stored materials, domestic labour, and the ability to return to the same prepared place night after night. The bed, in this longer view, is not the starting point of human sleep. It is one of its later outcomes, and even then, it did not immediately produce the kind of softness modern people now assume to be natural. What changed first was separation, then stability, then repetition. Only later, and unevenly, did deeper softness become common. This is why the modern experience of sleep can feel so different from the long human past. Today, many people lie down inside a system that has already solved many of the problems that earlier humans had to manage directly. The room is enclosed, the floor is dry, the bed is raised. The surface is designed to reduce pressure. The temperature is often controlled. The coverings are clean and repeatable. The sleeping place belongs to the individual and can be expected to perform in roughly the same way each night. This arrangement is not a biological constant. It is a historical achievement, and like all achievements, it changes what the body comes to expect. Once a person becomes used to this environment, even small deviations can feel disruptive. A surface that is too firm or too thin may seem immediately wrong. A room that is too cold or too warm may interrupt rest. A change in bedding may be enough to disturb the night. These reactions are real, but they are also shaped by familiarity. They belong to a body that has learned to rely on a highly managed form of sleep. Earlier humans, by contrast, lived within a wider range of conditions. This does not mean they were indifferent to comfort or unaware of discomfort. It means that the threshold for what counted as a workable night was shaped by a world where comfort was more limited, more variable, and more closely tied to environment and group life. The body adapted behaviorally to that world, not by becoming immune to pressure or cold, but by learning to rest within those limits often enough to continue. That is the quiet answer to the title. Most of human history slept on hard ground, because the human species existed for far longer than the systems required to make sleep consistently soft. The ground was not an error waiting to be corrected. It was the starting condition from which later improvements slowly emerged. And once we understand that, something else becomes visible. The modern bed is not only a place of rest, it is also a place where history is gathered. The softness, the dryness, the warmth, the structure, the stability, all of it represents layers of human effort that have gradually reshaped the night. We do not need to reject those layers to understand them. We only need to see that they are not as old as they feel. And when we see that, the distance between our bodies and the ground beneath them begins to look less like a natural divide and more like a long and ongoing human project, one that is still shaping how we sleep, how we feel, and how we understand what it means for a night to be truly restful. What remains after all of this is not a lesson about toughness, but a lesson about perspective. The modern sleeper often begins with the bed and judges everything else from there. If the surface feels wrong, the night feels wrong. If softness is missing, It can seem as though something essential to human rest has been violated, but the longer history we have traced suggests a quieter truth. What feels essential now is often the product of conditions that became widespread very late. For most of human existence, the body did not wait each night for an ideal sleeping surface, because such a surface was rarely available in any stable, repeatable form. It rested where rest could be made possible, on ground that was chosen, adjusted, lined, shared, warmed, and made tolerable within the limits of the time. That does not make the past admirable in a simple way, and it does not make modern comfort unnecessary. It only changes the scale of what we think is normal. The human species lived for a very long time before softness became a regular expectation. That fact alone should slow the instinct to treat the modern bed as the natural beginning of sleep rather than one of its latest refinements. This change in perspective matters because it gives the title its final depth. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Because the body was not sleeping inside the world we now inhabit. It was sleeping inside a world where architecture was thinner, materials were fewer, domestic space was less specialized, and comfort was assembled from partial advantages rather than delivered as a complete system. A dry patch mattered, a warmer patch mattered, a patch near others mattered, a layer of grass, a hide, a mat, a platform, a maintained floor. All of these could improve the night without transforming it into the kind of protected softness many people now assume sleep has always required. Once we see that, the past becomes less strange and the present becomes less invisible. The bed beneath the modern body stops looking like a simple object and starts looking like condensed history. It contains craft, labor, stored material, insulation, architecture, hygiene, domestic order, and the idea that a single person should have a reliable place prepared in advance for unconsciousness. That is not a small thing. It is one of the quiet achievements of settled life. Yet there is another side to that achievement. The more completely comfort surrounds the body, the easier it becomes to forget how recent that comfort is, and the easier it becomes to mistake a historically specific arrangement for human nature itself. Perhaps that is why this story matters beyond sleep. It reminds us that the body is always living inside history, even when history feels like instinct. The need for rest is ancient. The form in which rest is delivered is not, and when those two things blur together, we begin to judge the past too quickly and misunderstand the present too easily. A hard surface starts to look inhuman when in fact it was once the ordinary base condition of life. A soft bed starts to look timeless when in fact it is the outcome of many overlapping changes that humans slowly built around themselves. So this part closes with a smaller, calmer understanding. The question was never really whether ancient humans should have slept as we do now. It was whether we could still recognize our own species inside a much older arrangement of night. The answer seems to be yes, but only if we let go of the idea that comfort has always meant the same thing. For most of human history, rest was not the absence of pressure. It was the successful management of enough pressure, enough cold, enough exposure, and enough fatigue to reach morning. The earth remained near, the body remained vulnerable, and sleep still happened. That does not diminish the value of the modern bed. It clarifies it. It lets us see softness not as a timeless right of the species, but as one of the newest ways humans have learned to care for a body that, for far longer than we usually remember, once had to close its eyes with very little placed between itself and the ground. In the end, the question returns to the body, but not in the way it first appeared. At the beginning, the body lay down and felt something was wrong, a quiet resistance under the shoulder, the hip, the back of the head, a sense that rest should come more easily than it did. That feeling was real, and it remains real, but now, after moving through this long history, it begins to look different. It no longer feels like a simple signal from the body alone. It feels like a conversation between the body and a world that has changed around it. For most of human history, the body did not expect the ground to disappear beneath it. It expected to meet the ground, to adjust to it, to manage it through posture, through warmth, through arrangement, through closeness to others, through whatever thin layers could be placed between skin and surface. Sleep was not the removal of contact. It was the ability to remain in contact without losing rest entirely. That is a quieter definition than the one many people now carry. Today, sleep often begins with the expectation that pressure should be reduced, that the surface should give way, that the body should be held rather than resisted. And when that expectation is not met, the night can feel immediately unsettled. But that expectation is not ancient. It is the result of a long process in which human beings slowly placed more and more distance between themselves and the earth. The ground did not change. The relationship to it did, and that relationship is still changing. This is why the title of this video cannot be answered with a single sentence. Why did most of human history sleep on hard ground? Because the human story began there. Because the systems required to soften the night came much later. Because the body can rest within limits, even when those limits include pressure, cold, and exposure. Because human life was organized around what was possible, not what was ideal. And perhaps most quietly of all, because the idea of ideal sleep itself is something that had to be built. None of this asks us to reject the comfort we have now. The soft bed, the quiet room, the controlled temperature, the clean coverings, all of these are meaningful. They reduce strain, reduce cold, reduce disturbance, and allow the body to rest in ways that were not always available in the past. But understanding their history changes how we see them. It removes the illusion that they have always been there. It shows that what feels essential may in fact be recent, and what feels uncomfortable may once have been ordinary. And once that shift happens, something else becomes possible. The body lying awake on a firm surface no longer has to feel broken or misplaced. It can be understood as a body carrying a long memory, one that does not always match the world it now inhabits. A memory of nights that were less controlled, less separated, less softened, but still lived, still endured, still part of what it meant to be human. So the story ends not with an answer that closes the question, but with one that leaves it open in a different way. If the modern bed is one of the newest layers in the human night, then what else in our sense of rest feels natural only because it has become familiar? And if the ground was once so close to the body for so long, then how much of that older relationship still remains, quietly shaping how we feel, how we settle, and how we understand the simple act of closing our eyes?